Video games like Postal.
Going Postal.
Going Postal.
New video game. It's called Postal.
There are a lot of people that really wish we would go away, but it's never going to happen.
Their whole premise is so over the top. It's so ridiculous.
There was a video game called Postal. We just ran around shooting people.
Oh, this is going to piss off your viewers, isn't it? Oh,
well. Going Postal, The Legacy Foretold. A new documentary about the history of running with scissors. On Apple TV, Amazon, and Blu-ray. Go to goingpostaldoc.com. That's goingpostaldoc.com. And tell them In the Keep sent you. Hey man, are you tired? Coffee's just not doing it for you these days. Let's talk about something different. Let's talk about cacao. Cacao comes from the Theobroma plant. Broma means food, and Theo means, well, God. So why aren't more of us talking about this godlike food source? Packed with antioxidants, polyphenols, theobromine, which is like caffeine but without the jitters, healthy fat, low carbs, protein, magnesium, calcium, and the highest plant source concentration of iron known to man. Why aren't we consuming this stuff every day? Well, you can. Our partners at Cora Cacao offer ceremonial grade cacao, sustainably sourced, plant to paste from fair trade farms in the Mayan motherland of Guatemala. Cora Cacao is committed to delivering cacao products to you at reasonable prices in a way that makes the world a better place for all involved. Whether you're making morning cocoa lattes, iced cacao, hosting a meditation ceremony, or just doing alchemy in your mom's basement, Cora Cacao is committed to supplying you with the highest grade stuff for what you, your body, and your mind need. So head on over to coracacao.com. That's coracacao.com. Use promo code INTHEKEEP, one word, all caps, at checkout for 10% off your order. It's time to replace those bad habits with good ones, and using Cora Cacao for your energy and nutrient needs is a great place to start. I'm proud to call Cora Cacao a partner of In the Keep, and I hope that you will be proud to call them a new part of your daily routine. Much love.
I am working primarily with the main theme that is presented at my website, which is sometimes referred to as optimal civilization, or in my bolder moments, I do call it paradise on Earth. You know, when I was a little kid, I remember hearing that after you die, you can experience paradise on Earth. And my big question was, why can't we have paradise on Earth a little sooner? So I spent most of my early childhood learning everything I could in multiple fields, planning on doing writing, and I wasn't quite sure what I would be writing about it, but primarily I thought I would be writing about fiction. And with fiction, I eventually settled on the most challenging writing project I could imagine, which would be the story of an interdisciplinary genius who designs and builds Paradise City against the full force opposition of hell. And I spent my teenage years doing research in multiple fields, anticipating that I would be writing something along those lines. And in the course of doing that research, I found out a lot of things that I was not expecting to find out about history, science, multiple fields, technology. One of the ideas that really began to capture my imagination a lot was the idea that there may be advanced forms of technology that were developed somewhere, but were being suppressed. And I remember asking questions about that to a few people I would run into. And I would hear little stories here and there, but most people had no specifics. They had sometimes a gut feeling that I could be right, but they just weren't sure what the specifics were. And a lot of time went by, and eventually I did end up writing a ton of books. It was more than probably 30 major pieces of writing at this point. And those books include Natural Healing Self-Empowerment, Hidden History of Humanity, The Math Wizard, which is an attempt to resurrect the original 7-step path to enlightenment that was once taught in Atlantis, and multiple fictional novels. So that's a large part of why I am in this world.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with, like, I've got Chariots of the Gods sitting somewhere in this room,
Sure.
Sitchin. Of course, we've all seen the Ancient Aliens TV series and stuff, and I've had a few people that I've talked to about this. Barry Fitzgerald and Steve Mera are also great guys.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty well known, I guess, in the field. But let's just assume I'm relatively new to the whole alternative history world.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Did you want to ask a specific question, or do you want me to dive right in?
yeah, I do have a specific question because the thing that I have a background in linguistics. I don't
Sounds
understand how people claim that they read Sumerian. I can get it if they can read Akkadian. I understand that a lot of the sources about Anunnaki come from Mesopotamia and such, but
Mhm.
Sumerian itself, no one can read that. Maybe some people have an idea of what they think it says, but it's a language isolate, right? It's like the Finnish of its time.
Mhm.
There's no connection between Sumerian and Arabic, Aramaic, or any other language in the region, really. It's just like a strange tongue. So how is it that you guys go about understanding what they say?
Okay, so well, certainly it's an interesting question. It sounds like your linguistic knowledge may exceed my own, but I know that for the most part, you just mentioned Zechariah Sitchin. So would I be correct in guessing that you think Sitchin is one such person who thinks he has mastered reading Sumerian?
Well, he does seem to present the idea that he can, and then you also have people like I think Billy Carson in the current day is probably one of the folks that's giving this a twisted reality, perhaps, because he will talk about in the Sumerian tablets, it says this, right?
Mhm.
And I'm like, how do you know that? Well, it's like his answer to that is, well, I didn't really read it in Sumerian. I read it in another language that was allegedly translated from Sumerian. I'm like, okay, so you didn't read the Sumerian tablets. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me just say this. I know that for many people who are in this field, Sitchin is considered a patriarch in many ways. However, what I found in my research is I did disagree with that proposition.
Right.
I have not found Sitchin to be especially credible. And as a matter of fact, at a certain point in Hidden History of Humanity, I mentioned a story that is told by Sitchin, and I could not help but be struck by the fact that someone else had told a very similar story, and key elements of the story that Sitchin said were part of the story were not in the other version. And that really made me suspect. I started thinking that Sitchin was doctoring these stories
Sure.
and inserting what he wanted to put into that. Um, Here's an interesting thought that I'll toss out to you. It's not something that we can investigate while we're on the air, obviously, but um, I did have a scholar who is cited in Hidden History of Humanity who says that the phonetic values for the Sumerian language are a one-on-one match for Egyptian hieroglyphics.
Hmm.
And that actually fits into a much bigger story that I could get into. But in relation to piecing together the paths, I would certainly like to begin with the idea that translating things from Sumerian is certainly not the only piece of evidence we have to piece together the ancient past. There's a multitude of ways that this can be done. You have to look at cosmogony, geology. There's the fossil record. There's archaeology. There are linguistics to a certain extent. There is also architecture. There's so many different aspects from biomechanics. So there's a multitude of fields that you actually use to put all this together. So I think one of the best places for me to start is just to start with what I call the overview.
Okay.
Because if I don't give this overview, all the questions are just eventually going to lead back to the overview. So what I like to do is start with a tour of the solar system. So when we go on a tour of the solar system, I won't go into all the details because even if we do have a longer format here, we could spend the entire podcast going over nothing but the solar system. But what we find when we look at the solar system is that our solar system does appear as if it has been wrecked. And then the question becomes, how did it become wrecked? But first, let's try to consider some of the evidence indicating that our solar system is wrecked. So one of the first things we learned from Kepler and his laws of planetary motion are that the planets orbit around the sun in ellipses. But if you study an ellipse as a mathematical figure, you'll find that it derives from two focal points called foci. Now, our sun is at one of those focal points, but there's nothing at the other. So why does it appear as if every planet in our solar system is acting as if this is a solar system based on two suns and there's only one? So that's an interesting question. The next question we have is, why are the planets looking the way that they do? We have the inner planets, which are sometimes referred to as rocky or terrestrial planets. And then once we get past Mars, we suddenly have an asteroid belt. And then once we get past the asteroid belt, we have four gas giants. And then once we get beyond the four gas giants, we have what's called the planet Pluto, but it's orbiting about 17 degrees off what's called the solar plane. I call it the solar plane because that's a briefer way to express what that plane is. The official term, I believe, is the invariable plane of the solar system or something like that, but it just takes a lot longer to say that. But in any case, that's a very bizarre way to set up a solar system. So there was an investigator at one point who started asking questions, especially in relation to a concept in astrophysics called Bode's law. So according to Bode's law, each planet should be roughly twice as far away from the sun as the planet before it. And the equation works extremely well, except for when you get to the space between Mars and Jupiter. There you find an asteroid belt where the equation predicts you should find a planet. So eventually people were led to a hypothesis. Is it possible that there was a planet between Mars and Jupiter and that it exploded? The best investigator in this particular area is the scientist Dr. Tom Van Flandern. And he eventually posited what he called the exploded planet hypothesis. His work is easily found on the internet. Just do searches for Van Flandern. And when you do, you will see all the evidence he has accumulated that show pretty conclusively that there was a planet between Mars and Jupiter, that it did blow up. And when we use his model, we not only have explanations for the physical characteristics of the asteroids themselves, which are very unusual. They show signs of charring, intense heat, they're diamond studded. It looks as if this was indeed once a planet at a certain point. But the hypothesis also accounts for the stripping of the atmosphere away from Mars, the accumulation of Mars' two moons, Phobos and Deimos. If you look up Deimos, you'll see that it looks like a large chunk of rock. It really does not look like a moon, or
Just
that's
before
in any way.
you made this segment, I had already Googled the moons of Mars because I was going to bring that up. So, yeah.
Okay. So this is a trivia question. Let me see if I can beat you to your Googling and see how you fare on this trivia question, because I ask this question of pretty much all my hosts.
Sure.
How many moons do you think Jupiter has?
I think that's depending on how you define moons, right?
It does, but the technology that we have to scan is improving all the time, so they feel fairly confident in their accuracy of their guess. So what do you think the last guess was?
97.
Very good. The correct last count that I heard was 95. Could have gone up to 97 since the last time I heard it. But yeah, 95. So that's a little curious, is it not? I mean, how are we going to have a model accounting for the generation of a solar system where the Earth supposedly has one moon? And I may return back to that curious subject a little bit later. But the Earth has one moon and Jupiter has 95. What's going on there? And why is the moon distribution so far off? When we go back to Van Flandern's hypothesis, it does appear as if a planet exploded, that the explosion was generated from the inner side of the solar system, such that most of the debris went out into the solar system, impacting the next four planets, transforming them from terrestrial planets into gas giants. At the same time, Mars was stripped of its atmosphere, Jupiter accumulated all of these moons, and the entire solar system was transformed. It's also possible that there was a second planetary explosion at the outer edge of the solar system, and that Pluto's deviant trajectory is a result of that. So when Van Flandern put all this together, he tried to figure out how long ago could this event have occurred. He came up with a number, 3.2 million years ago. So when he came up with that number, he then looked to the geologists on planet Earth and said, hey, could you guys look at the geological layer corresponding to 3.2 million years ago and tell us what you see? So when they did that, they didn't seem to find any evidence that was backing up what Van Flandern was saying. So he was being a very humble researcher, and he said, well, maybe I'm wrong. So I will put my evidence out there so others can consider it. But I guess if the geologists are not backing me up, it seems I could be mistaken. But however, there are authors such as Joseph Farrell, author of Cosmic War, and researchers like myself who feel that Van Flandern actually did do excellent work, and it could be the geologists who were wrong. Because when the geologists went through the layers and asked the question, is there any layer in the geological strata that correspond to an exploded planet event? Yes, there is a layer, and that layer is at 65 million years ago, which is the time when most people believe that the dinosaurs became extinct. Now, some people may say, well, how can you reconcile these two things? We have the astrophysicists saying that this occurred 3.2 million years ago. We have geologists saying that the layer that seems to closely match that is at 65 million years ago. Well, it might actually match if the geologists have absolutely no clue what they're doing. Because when you look at what the geologists have done, they have this theory that they're guided by called uniformitarianism. And basically with uniformitarianism, the idea is that if you go down a given amount in the soil, it's supposed to correspond to a given number of years. So this is purely hypothetical here, but it's just based on giving an example for the sake of illustration. So let's say that you go down 2 inches in the layer, and that's supposed to correspond to 100,000 years. Well, if someone does, let's say, a sediment test, and they think that this is a valid hypothesis, they're going to rigidly cling to the idea that every single time you go down 102 inches, it's going to correspond to that same amount of time. But it appears as if the geologists have made absolutely no effort whatsoever to do a compensation factor for the idea that there could have been an exploded planet. Now, if there was an exploded planet and this hypothesis holds true, it seems that rocks the size of cities could have been impacting planet Earth. And the geologists are just going to shrug and say, no, that would have no impact on our understanding of geological time. I think that's ridiculous. I think that if giant, massive rocks the size of Cleveland were hitting the planet Earth, then our understanding of geological time is suspect, that there would have been a factor such that when you're looking through geological time, the events that you think occurred 65 million years ago may very well have occurred 3.2 million years ago. So I would guess that the layers actually do match, and it's the geologist's fault for not coming up with a compensation factor for an exploded planet. So when we have that as our hypothesis, we're now looking at what could be an exploded planet 3.2 million years ago. And then the question becomes, do we think that that's natural or unnatural? Well, it appears, especially since the explosion seems to have occurred from the inner side and not right in the heart of the planet, that this is artificial, that this is possibly what Farrell calls it, a cosmic war that was being fought by groups that were not of this world. According to our fossil record, our particular species didn't become quite so intelligent until approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, our species being called Homo sapiens. So that means if it was not Homo sapiens that was out in the solar system fighting a war, then who was? I use that as a starting point to get us started. And then I go into the origins of life, which is also a very long topic, but I propose a new theory of the origins of species, which I call conformation. This is different from the other theories that are out there. So we have the theory of religious creationism, which suggests that the Earth popped into existence magically at about 4004 BC, according to some. We have the theory of Darwinian evolution, which states that species gradually change over millions of years in brutal fitness contests. And when various random mutants are created and many of them are not viable, and so they disappear, despite the fact that fossil record does not actually back that up. And then we do have some, of course, vying for the ancient aliens theories that you were lightly mentioning in relation to a television show from before. Mm-hmm. But when we look at the ancient fossil record and see that Homo sapiens did begin about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, and it was not us who could have been out there in the outer solar system, we then turn to the history of planet Earth and see what we can figure out. So then I turn to congressional testimony where an official testified before Congress that 57 different extraterrestrial species had been identified and cataloged. This is his testimony, which I have linked in my book. So once we have that, then we next turn to the question of all the extraterrestrial species who could be out there, which three seem to have had the biggest impact on the history of Earth? And then I gather all the evidence and present the case that appears as if there were three demonstrable alien superpowers. They are as follows. The first would be from the Pleiades star system. They stand 10 to 12 feet tall. They look pretty much just like us. They have blonde or gold hair, blue eyes, fair skin. They founded the civilization that we would call Atlantis. This was a continent that once existed in the Atlantic Ocean. There is a second group, which I call the Cyanians. In all probability, the Cyanians are Syrians, but I'm not 100% sure on that, so I just call them Cyanians for a reason I'll explain in a moment. The Cyanians were also known as the Namos. They were described by the Dogon tribe of Mali. They were also giants. Their heights have been estimated based on the length of the tomb of Osiris, who I would argue was a Cyanian. And now for a little description of the Cyanians. Not only were they giants, but they had elongated skulls. In anthropology, we call this being dolichocephalic, which means an elongated skull. And these were vertically dolichocephalic, which is significant because later we will see that there was a species that was diagonally dolichocephalic, a reptilian group. But the amphibious group, the Namos, had green or blue skin, and they had legs just like human beings have, but they also had tails like a fish. And we do see depictions of ancient carvings showing beings along these lines, although I have to break that down a little bit, and I'll do so. But the reason for the blue skin appears to be, from my research in zoology, due to a different blood oxygen carrier. So we human beings have a blood oxygen carrier we call hemoglobin, which is an iron-based molecule. We use this to carry oxygen into our systems. Now, normally, oxygen is a ravager in chemistry. It destroys, it oxidizes, it corrodes and rusts. It's just kind of like a crazy miracle of life that we thrive on one of the most dangerous elements in the periodic table, but we do. And we do that thanks to hemoglobin. But hemoglobin is not the only oxygen carrier that nature offers, even on our planet. There's another one that's called hemocyanin. And in the same way that hemoglobin is based on iron, hemocyanin is based on copper. And it is preferred in environments of low oxygen saturation. In other words, environments that aquatic animals might use, like, for example, cephalopods that have elongated heads, or octopi that have elongated heads. As I mentioned in my study of zoology, cephalopods are considered the most intelligent of invertebrates. So if there was any species that we're looking at in the invertebrates that would be likely to attain advanced intelligence, you might actually consider cephalopods to be a perfect example. And again, they have that hemocyanin blood carrier. Also, with marine organisms, we see another strange characteristic of being hermaphrodites. So there's two different kinds of hermaphrodites that appear in terrestrial biology. One is called simultaneous hermaphrodites. Another is called sequential hermaphrodites. So with sequential hermaphrodites, for example, with fish, sometimes given certain environmental pressures, fish will change from male to female or female to male, depending on what's needed to help the species procreate. Simultaneous hermaphrodites have characteristics of both male and female simultaneously. They're able to reproduce on their own without a partner. Now, how is that relevant to what we find directly in Earth history? It took me some digging. You were mentioning Graham Hancock there at the opening. So in one of his books, R. Boval makes the following statement, that there was once a historian in ancient Egypt whose name is Manetho. He wrote a book called History of Egypt. This book was lost. However, there were commentators on Manetho's work. So in other words, there were other people who were quoting from Manetho's work, even though we lost Manetho's work itself. And in those commentaries, we heard that Manetho stated the following. In Egypt, he had seen 345 wooden effigies of the former divine and semi-divine rulers of Egypt. And he found that they reproduced without the agency of women, and that they represented a third race that was not the Atlanteans. Well, that's an absolute perfect match for the species that I'm describing as Cyanians. And again, I would argue that Osiris does represent the Cyanians. Now, if we take that clue and then we combine that with the following clue, we really feel like we're getting somewhere. So we'll find that I often say this. I often say that physically in the ancient world, all roads may lead to Rome, but metaphysically, all roads somehow seem to lead to Giza. We find that the records of the ancient Egyptians are actually more extensive than most people realize. So, in a book called Secret of the Bible by author Tony Bushby, this was his second book themed on the subject of Jesus, the character of the Bible, he tells us that the Egyptian historians had this in their records. Now, this was from Herodotus. He was a famous ancient historian. He got a lot of his information from the records in Egypt, and he stated the following, that the sky gods' traffic began in 17,500 BC, that Osiris first appeared at 15,500 BC, and that the traffic from the sky gods ended at 11,850 BC. So now we have a correspondence between what Manetho was saying in the history of Egypt about former divine rulers of Egypt who reproduced without the agency of women, and this traffic from the sky gods. This all seems to back up the idea that the Cyanians had their primary bases on two more lost continents. One was in the Indian Ocean. This was called Lemuria, and another one that existed in the Pacific Ocean called Pan or Mu. And there's a multitude of evidence I could get into in relation to that. But before I do that, I should introduce the third group, which is a reptilian group, which appears to hail from the Draco system as well as the Orion system. It seems as if the two formed some kind of alliance or whatever. But in relation to this group, they appear to be extremely hostile. So I want to back up to the Pleiadians for a second, the group that founded Atlantis, and then tie them into Giza. So here's where we want to use some geodetic maths for orientation, because this is extremely important to the story. So there is a scientist by the name of Richard Hoagland, and he's posited an idea he calls tetrahedral physics, which is the idea of inserting a tetrahedron into a sphere and then looking at where the points touch the surface and look for significant events at the surface of the planet. However, that's not the only form of such math that you can do. There's another form of math which is actually probably much more important. That happens when you take a cube and you insert it into a sphere. Now, when you do that, just like the tetrahedron, the cube will touch the surface of the Earth at specifically 8 points. Those points are going to be at approximately 30 degrees of latitude off the equator. Now, what do we find on planet Earth when we look at exactly the points where a cube would touch a sphere? Well, one of the first points that we hit, Giza, the exact location where the Great Pyramid in Egypt is located. Now, what happens if we follow through with that math? It becomes extremely interesting when we do that. First thing we can do is go 90 degrees west. So anyone can get a map and look at this and verify what I'm saying. Go exactly 90 degrees west of Giza. What point do you hit? The Bermuda Triangle. And it is in my research that I strongly indicate that the capital of Atlantis, Poseidonis, was located exactly 90 degrees west of Giza. From here, we use the writings and the readings of the great psychic Edgar Cayce, whose accuracy was far higher than any other psychic that I'm aware of. And he told us of beings who came down and helped create our species, Homo sapiens, at approximately 210,000 years ago. So that matches the 200,000 to 300,000 years ago time frame for the creation of Homo sapiens. So now it's beginning to be suggested that our species was engineered through Pleiadians. Next, we turn to Greek mythology. Here we have the myth that is recounted by Plato in his dialogues concerning Atlantis. He states that when he's telling these stories in the dialogues, that these are not fairy tales, this is not fiction, this is actual history. And what does he say? He states that in Atlantis, there was a god who he calls Poseidon. That Poseidon mated with a mortal woman named Cleito and gave birth to 5 sets of twins, 10 males. These 10 males are named. They had as mates 7 women who became later known by the nickname of the Pleiades. And from there, we see what appears to be the exact manifestation of Cro-Magnon Man. So Cro-Magnon Man is a huge problem for either the people in the religious creationist camp or the Darwinian evolutionist camp. So this is why I actually have become quite confident in my research, because it actually makes more sense than any other theory.
You're listening to KEEP in the Keep. Please take a moment to tell at least one other person how much you enjoy the show. That's right. Grab that link and send it to that buddy you're thinking of who you know would be interested in what we're talking about right now. Maybe post it somewhere. I know it seems scary, but you can do it. I believe in you. Don't hesitate to leave a comment and a 5-star review, a like, wherever you're listening. And if you want, Patreon supporters for this show get episodes early, access to our secret Discord channel, chances to suggest questions to our guests, our games, and whatever else I can do for you. Every little bit helps. This podcast directly supports my ability to do what I love and take care of my growing family. The link is in the show notes. Thank you, bless you, stay in the keep.
How does Cro-Magnon Man suddenly appear at 30,000 BC? When we look at the anatomy of Cro-Magnon Man, we do see a number of distinct things. He stands taller. His skull shape is different. We mentioned dolichocephaly before. Cro-Magnon Man features mesocephaly. This is a different skull shape. He clearly has a higher forebrain capacity. Neanderthal man, who precedes him, actually has a larger overall cranial capacity, but his skull shape is what we call brachycephalic. This is short-skulled. This is the sloping back forehead. So with that type of skull shape, you're going to see lesser intelligence and intellect because most of the intellect is seated in the forebrain. So now we have Cro-Magnon Man suddenly appearing at 30,000 BC, and then when we geographically trace Cro-Magnon Man, where are we led? Atlantis, and specifically the remnants of Atlantis that we have that are most significant to this day, which are the Canary Islands and the Azores. Cro-Magnon remains have been found there. Now, of course, Cro-Magnon itself does come from the village in France where those remains were first identified, and artwork with unusually high sophistication for primitive man was demonstrated in cave paintings. You can look up that artwork for yourself at any time. But when we trace things back, we see a number of things that are extremely curious. So when I ask most people, think of a native African, what do you imagine? Very few people are going to say that they imagine somebody with blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin. However, there is a precedent for such a group. We see the Berbers and the Guanches are two groups of human beings who oddly have blonde hair and blue eyes and were well known to have existed in Africa in ancient times. Where did they come from? Why is it that it seems we can trace their roots specifically to Atlantis? All of these clues indicate that it really was the Pleiadians who mated when Poseidon mated with Cleito, spawned the demigod line, which gradually became diluted over time as humans mated more with each other than they did with Pleiadians. And eventually we ended up with Cro-Magnon Man, who eventually fled Atlantis and became the progenitors of the Europeans. This is not the only piece of evidence. There's so much more. And I know that we have a decent amount of time to get into it a little bit further. I'm just going to cover some basic territory before I open this up to go a lot of different directions. I just want to reinforce the case that I'm making here.
No, by all means, man. It's what I'm here for.
Okay, so we do have further genetic evidence because apparently someone was doing some genetic investigations into the origins of humanity, and we have two investigators that are of extreme importance. One is named Brian Sykes. He was doing an investigation into the origins of humanity, and he found at least these two things. When he traced human origins genetically, this was his conclusion. Every European human being comes from one of 10 males or one of 7 females. That is a 100% perfect match for Greek mythology. Secondly, we also had a story that popped up in my research. I had no idea what to do with this story at the time. I just filed it away, but now I can explain it later, and I may do so when we get to that point. But the story says that when they were researching human genetics, they also found something else, a new what's called haplogroup in genetics. I have a link for this information in Hidden History of Humanity so others can look it up and read it for themselves. But it states that Pleiadian DNA had been discovered in humans introduced into Denmark at approximately 4,000 years ago. And there's no explanation given. The article concludes with saying they have no idea how this DNA suddenly appeared in Denmark. And the amazing thing for me was that my later research then showed exactly how that DNA ended up being inserted there from Atlanteans. That's another story.
For just a
Sure,
second.
go ahead.
I actually lived in Denmark for 2 years. If you go back to the Eddas, like, so if you read the prose Edda by Sturli Sturluson, who is actually a native of Iceland, but he cites in the beginning of his story that the legend of Odin is that he actually came to the north migrating from Turkey and is the father of all of the people who live there.
I'm curious, and with your study of linguistics, because you'd be an excellent person to ask this question. So one of my other references, we don't have to go all the way into this particular point right now. I'm just asking this since we're in the neighborhood. Are you familiar with the Oralinda book?
No. What's this?
Okay, so yeah, you'll definitely be extremely interested in that. So since you have linguistic background, I'll just toss this out there because I know we can't possibly do this while the podcast is in progress, but if you ever investigate it later, I'd be really interested to hear what your take is on this. So I came across this in Harold Wilkins' book, Secret Cities of Old South America, and it was a very important puzzle piece to link together the story of Odin and the true origins of Norse mythology. But the story goes, and again, you can make up your own mind on this. It's very easy to access this information, that there was a documentation that began in ancient times and was carried through multiple generations in an ancient language known as Frisian. Frisian is derived from Freya, who you will recognize in Norse mythology as
Frisian is still a language today in the Netherlands and on the border of the Netherlands and Germany and Denmark.
So the Oralinda book was translated from Frisian into English, and copies of it are available today, and they tell the story of Odin and his relative, who appears to be Neptune. And the reason why his relative is Neptune is because apparently the original name from which Neptune derives is Neef Tunis, which in that ancient language apparently translates as cousin Tunis. And they were part of a naval military group that helped to defend the Frisians in ancient times. So this was part of me piecing together the story of Atlantis, because it as we get past the fall of Atlantis, which does appear to be historically accurate along the Plato timeline, meaning that Atlantis could have gone down at approximately 9600 BC, that there was a later Atlantean colony. Now I make distinctions with my colonies here because Atlantis breaks up into pieces. The western side is the Poseidia, however you want to pronounce that side, and then the other side, the eastern side, is called the Aryan side. So the Atlanteans who flee set up several colonies, which may very well have existed long before people fled Atlantis, but they're all over the Mediterranean basin. Most of those colonies, however, are Aryan colonies or Ogygian colonies. So the Ogygian group was an island to the northeast of Atlantis, closer to the Canary Islands and the Azores and closer to Ireland. And a lot of the refugees from Atlantis fled north into Ireland and then eventually crossed through what we would call the British Isles today and eventually crossed the North Sea. However, this Posidonian group set up another major colony whose importance is extreme to understanding hidden history. As a matter of fact, when you're trying to go over certain aspects of hidden history, by what's going on, and by that I mean there's been what appears to be a Sumerian rewrite of history. And after an ancient war, which I'm trying to get to, I call this war the Reptile-Cyanian War. It was a battle over Giza. So history was rewritten, and when it was rewritten, the story of Atlantis was expurgated and purged out of the story to such an extreme degree that history doesn't even make sense. And this is because the story of Atlantis and her colonies has been deliberately removed because someone didn't want us to understand our true heritage and the true path to freedom. But the main point I want to get to before moving on was that there is yet another lost civilization that is a little mysterious when you go over the ancient past, that never seems to be fully resolved. And this group's name was Hyperborea.
Yeah.
So
I was going to
what
bring up
was
the Hyperboreans earlier because I believe in Theosophy, they talk about the Hyperboreans preceding the Atlanteans and the Lemurians, but that they reproduced by budding, which is analogous to what you were talking about earlier.
Oh, okay. Well, I had not heard that particular one from the Theosophists, but I'm going to let that part of the story go. I'm just going to mention the part of it that made sense to me. So, and I will get back to this as I redevelop the story. I just want to insert the concept of Hyperborea here for a second.
Yep.
So in the Orlinda book, it mentions a Posidonian Atlantean colony that once existed in the North Sea and did go under. There's a specific date given in the Orlinda book for when this colony went under. It was 2193 BC. And the Orlinda book is not the only book to reference this island that once existed in the North Sea. Several other sources back it up. Diodorus of Sicily is one of many. And there's also this controversial story that I will get to in its proper time slot called the Atlantis Chronicles that mentions the founding of this Hyperborean island. It has another name that it goes by more often, Basilea or Basilia. There's a few different variations of that particular name too. But when this colony was founded, this would be the reason why this Pleiadian DNA ended up being inserted. It was from the Atlanteans, who I would argue were originally Pleiadian. I'm just going to back up a little bit to the main storyline and move forward to the Reptile-Cyanian War before I do a pause and we can start going off in different directions.
By all means.
Okay. So Atlantis is founded, and I believe that when you look closely at trying to understand what the Pleiadians were capable of doing, you have to turn to the apex of their technology. This is one of the questions I get very, very often. Where's the advanced technology? You're saying these people are from the stars. What could they do? Well, I'll tell you what they could do. They could build great pyramids. And for people who don't understand how significant a great pyramid is, I will first of all tell you that it was not a tomb. I mean, it was just very ridiculous to assume that someone would erect the structure that was later be referred to as the first wonder of the ancient world as a tomb. Very ridiculous. But when you truly want to understand what a great pyramid can do, you would do research along the lines of what I have done. So we start with Christopher Dunn, who wrote a book called The Giza Power Plant. He's a no-nonsense machinist. He wasn't interested in mysticism or anything fantastical at all. He just looked coldly at the Great Pyramid as a structure, and he figured out how it worked. And he came up with his theory, which he presents with a great deal of science. Did an excellent, fantastic job, in my opinion, writing that book. So from there, that was built upon by author Joseph Farrell, who's no slouch when it comes to physics. And he wrote a trilogy called the Giza Death Star Trilogy, and shows an even more sophisticated model of what the Great Pyramid could do. And that research, in turn, has been followed up by the researcher by the name of Gregory Herman. He's a more recent entry into the field. His research is also truly spectacular. It's available online. You can look up his work at any time. He will show you diagrams of what he's uncovered about the inner workings of the Great Pyramid. So since most people are obviously not going to do that research, but they can if they want to, and they would just like to
writing down the name of every book that you mentioned, and I'm gonna link them in the article at least. Like here's where you can find it online, and I'll probably grab several of them. I've got a really long reading list, but that's okay. Like I have a long life ahead of me, I hope. But just so you know, like I will have, or at least attempt to gather as many of these as possible for people to grab in the show notes.
Man, I'm enjoying your conversation more and more with every passing second. It's so great to research, to converse with someone who has the background that you do. It just makes everything just so much better. In any event, I will tell you then, once you've sort of absorbed all of the material as I have, you are led into the following neighborhood. So a Great Pyramid would have degrees of functionality. Okay, so we're going to talk about the base level of functionality and we'll work our way up to the advanced. So the base level of functionality is preservation of food. So this, of course, is going to be significant to any advanced civilization. They would want to be able to preserve food, and they would probably not use refrigerators. So how would they do that? So it was actually Harold Wilkins, the author of Secret Cities of Old South America, who had a little section where he said that he was in Holland, of all places, where he found that some inventor had created a device which was generating a preservation field around food, and that the food could exist, pretty much eternally. It would never decay. It would never rot when it was in the presence of this field. this is evidently what a Great Pyramid could also do. There have been several experiments that have suggested the Great Pyramids are capable of such preservation fields. But I would then argue that the second wonder of the ancient world, which is called the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, is actually directly related to the Great Pyramid in Egypt. Now, some people may say, well, how in the world could you possibly say that? Babylon is way far away from where the Great Pyramid was. Well, actually, it was not. And
Not
the
that
reason
far.
for that, no, well,
Yeah.
it's much closer than people think.
Yeah.
In Secret in the Bible, by Tony Bushby, which is a book I mentioned earlier, he shows you a map of old Cairo. And when you're looking at Cairo itself, what was its ancient name? Babylon. That's how close Babylon was to the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It was as close as Cairo. So it appears as if the original Hanging Gardens of Babylon were actually grown in the light of the Great Pyramid. Which brings us to this idea of preservation. So one of our greatest geniuses of all time is named Nikola Tesla, and he did a whole bunch of different fantastic work. He pretty much gave us the foundations of our technology and our civilization. He did multiple experiments. Many of people are going to be familiar with his work in alternating current, but he did so much more than that. He gave us radio. He gave us remote control. He
It's
did
the ghost box.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
And among other things that he did, he was working with the generation of light. And one of the things he did was he oscillated calcium sulfide at 10,000 hertz. This gave off cold phosphorescent light. Why is the cold part important? In the research of the late great Victor Schauberger, he talked about the ultimate technology has a characteristic of cold silence. Cold silence means that there is no friction, because when you have friction in the system, it will usually manifest as either heat or noise. So obviously, if you have the best technology, it operates in cold silence. Phosphorescent light would be ideal if we could get it to work in our lighting systems because it's cold to the touch, meaning that there's no friction. Now, what did Tesla do? He oscillated calcium sulfide at 10,000 hertz to give off phosphorescent light and created a new form of photograph he sometimes called the phosphograph. But where is calcium sulfide often found? Limestone. And where is limestone found in relation to the Great Pyramid at Giza? It is the outer casing of the Great Pyramid. So my theory then becomes that the energy generation within the Great Pyramid oscillated the calcium sulfide in its exterior casing such that it gave off phosphorescent light that was full spectrum light. So for people who are not familiar with full spectrum light, when you light up a light bulb, you can put up a spectrometer to it and you can see the range of frequencies that are being emitted by that light. And it turns out that most of the lights that we use, whether they're incandescent or fluorescent, don't give off the full spectrum of light that sunlight does. One of the main consequences of that is that if you're trying to grow your plants indoors to, let's say, grow food inside your apartment, you're not going to be able to do that with incandescent or fluorescent light. However, in my apartment right now, the lights are full spectrum light. I got them from a company called Blue Max. That's one of the best companies I found out there.
So these are LED lights of some kind.
They are. They have variations of light. You can go to their website. Some of their LEDs, I think there are ones that are not LEDs if I remember correctly. But
so like even our sun, just to be like for the sake of the audience, even our own sun does not emit the full spectrum of light. Every star has its own chemical makeup. When you use a fluorescent light or an incandescent light, they have a chemical makeup themselves, which gives off whatever that particular hue is, and that can also be affected, of course, by the shade of the glass, those kinds of things. It wasn't really until LED was invented, at least in the modern world, that people had an idea that you could have like what you might call pure white light, like that truly encapsulates all of the spectrum of light, at least to the best of our ability to see. So like in the visual spectrum, we have evolved to see sunlight over the course of however long that's been for us. We may have different interpretations of what that is. If you think the Earth is 6,000 or 4,000 years old, of course, but
right. So we have these different kinds of light, and obviously, if you could give off full spectrum light, then that would mean that some of the ancient records that describe the Great Pyramid as lighting up in such a way that night was turned to day and plants could grow, such as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, around the clock, we now have an explanation for how that could have been done. Obviously, that would be tremendous advantage to a civilization to have unlimited, undecaying food. It's very reassuring to have that in your background. So this would be, again, the lowest level of functionality for a Great Pyramid. The next level of functionality is as a telecommunications device. Now, we once again turn to Tesla's work. So when he was doing his early work in Colorado Springs, he has models of devices that end in copper spheres. These would be resonant copper spheres. So basically, you power up your system and you generate a signal and that is sent to a copper sphere. And if another copper sphere is exactly mass resonant, it will pick up that communication signal. So this is communication by resonance. And it appears as if the Great Pyramid did the exact same thing, only instead of using copper spheres, it was using a capstone, the Pyramidian capstone, as it is called. So the Pyramidian capstone would resonate with all other capstones that were either octaves or harmonics of the capstone that was on top of the Great Pyramid. This would be instantaneous communication. And it was actually even more sophisticated than the forms of communication that we know, because most of the communication that we've done has been through electromagnetic waves. However, if you work with electromagnetic waves, you run into problems with lag times. And there also can be attenuation of the signal. So you would want to optimize your carrier waves. And as Christopher Dunn describes in the Giza power plant, plasma was generated inside the Great Pyramid. Now, what's the significance of plasma? I do a lot of work in health. And what I find with the work in health is that there's a branch of healing that's called frequency medicine. So frequencies of what? Well, you can work with different frequencies of things to heal. You can work with frequencies of electricity. You can work with frequencies of light. You can work with frequencies of sound. But what's special about plasma? Well, what's special about plasma? It can travel through walls like they're not even there. So when you work with electricity, for example, in the work of Dr. Hulda Clark, author of Cure for All Diseases, she gives you a warning that the frequencies that she works with her mini frequency generator tend to travel around the outside of organs. They won't penetrate all the way to the inside. So if you're trying to use her healing strategy of destructive resonance, which is you find the operating frequency of a pathogen, you use destructive resonance to obliterate it. You can't necessarily access it if it's inside the core of an organ if you're using electricity, because electricity is going to travel around the outside of the organ. Plasma, however, was used by the innovator James Baer, who followed in the wake of the great researcher Royal Raymond Rife. And Rife had found he could oscillate any pathogen in such a way as to destroy it. He actually had a 100% success rate in obliterating cancer in the 1930s before his work was suppressed. And Baer carried that work forward by working with plasma. But the point being that if you're trying to recreate your carrier waves not using electromagnetic waves, find something that is extremely efficient, something that would communicate not only instantaneously across the planet, but maybe you wanted to involve your telecommunications with the Pleiades home star system. Lag time would become a huge deal if you used electromagnetic waves, but it wouldn't if you used plasma etheric resonance, which a Great Pyramid was capable of doing. So the third degree of operation functionality for a Great Pyramid would be power generation. So in the same way that you could use telecommunication signals resonantly, you could resonate power. So this is exactly what Tesla was trying to do when he set up the Wardenclyffe Tower in New York. He was about to broadcast free power to the world. At one point, supposedly, Tesla interacted with the great psychic Edgar Cayce, and Cayce told Tesla, "You are a reincarnated Atlantean." Well, isn't that amazing? Because everything I'm saying right now indicates that Tesla was doing that very thing, which was reincarnating the technology of Atlantis. So the power generation would work resonantly, and as Cayce describes in his visions, he keeps talking about flying craft that are going through the sky, and they're not actually working on the power that's inside their own engines. They're receiving power that's being broadcast to them from afar somehow. Oh, I wonder how that worked. Well, it appears as if it worked from the resonant capstone of the Great Pyramid. And the final level of functionality for the Great Pyramid is as a defensive device. So I was mentioning destructive resonance a moment ago. In the Joseph Farrell trilogy, the Giza Death Star trilogy, he suggests interferometry, which would be essentially like glorified radar. It would be the ability to select a target anywhere on the planet, overload it with so much energy that it would result in subnuclear annihilation. Now, that may sound pretty harsh for what I portray as a peace-loving culture, the Pleiadians, but I think you have to understand the context in which they were creating their structures. This was a device, a great pyramid, placed on a planet that was in a solar system that had already seen an exploded planet. The Earth was still being bombarded by meteorites for long after 3.2 million years ago. There have been comet passes that have placed all life on this planet at risk. There has always been the risk that there could be another meteorite impact on the planet. It is my belief that the Great Pyramid system was intended to be a shield for all of planet Earth, and it would stabilize the planet. Dunn talks about this in the Giza power plant. Alexander Golod, a researcher in Russia, backs up his claims, stating that part of what you're trying to do is stabilize what's called the etheric grid. So understanding the etheric grid takes a moment. I have a link. Well, actually, I need to get this link in there. I mentioned the researcher. Her name is, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Betthehagens. So that could be Beth Hoggins. But in any case, she has a YouTube video describing the sacred grid. But basically, this is a geodesic grid in nature. And R. Buckminster Fuller, whose work was important to my work in creating a three-dimensional periodic table of the elements, talks about the 5 platonic solids and what happens when you turn them into a sphere. If you combine all of them together, which is very easy to do in a shape I call the omnihedron, and blow that up into a circle, you will create a grid of lines. And it appears as if on our planet there is such an etheric grid. And this etheric grid is important for telecommunications. It was used by the great inventor, Nathan Stubblefield. I have a link to his work in the technology section of my website. He actually created a superior form of etheric telephony in the late 1800s, right before Tesla was about to do his work. Supposedly, Stubblefield's telephone was actually better than Tesla's was. Stubblefield was actually working with etheric carrier waves. Now, I know that for people who are steeped in the conventional science, they're going to say, well, no, there was an experiment that was done that disproved that ether existed. And what Joseph Farrell points out is that that experiment was not valid. It was not done correctly. Ether was not disproven. There have been tons of people who worked with what I would call ether physics, and all of their work has been consistently suppressed, almost as if someone does not want us to know that ether physics exists. People who've worked with ether physics include Nikola Tesla, Wilhelm Reich, Baron von Reichenbach, who wrote a whole book on the subject called Researches into the Vital Force. Several other people have done work, and all of that work has been suppressed. So the thing with ether is that it's a higher frequency energy. So in the 1800s, when the telegraph lines were first getting put up, everyone assumed that they were going to work with electromagnetic signals. But they started noticing some weird stuff going on. So one of the things that would happen is they would try to maintain the telegraph lines, and to maintain the telegraph lines from time to time, they would dig down into the earth and check on the status of the battery. Well, they would go to certain locations where they had a perfectly clear signal, and they would find that the battery was completely eroded away. It was gone. There was like no way that it could possibly be transmitting a signal. So how was it doing that? And the answer is they were on the etheric grid. So apparently Marconi ran afoul of this. George Vassiliadis wrote 2 excellent books that were important to my research. One is called Lost Science. The other is called Secrets of Cold War Technology. But basically what's described in there is that when Marconi was trying to develop radio using electromagnetic waves to carry his signals, if he sent the signal one way, it would get snuffed. If he sent it another way, the signal would get amplified. That is the etheric grid in action. And it appears as if when you look back on planet Earth at all the sacred sites where temples arose or structures like the Great Pyramid arose, all of them appear on this sacred etheric grid. And it's not an accident. They're there because that's going to enhance your telecommunication signals. Everything's going to be cleaner when you're working with the grid as opposed to against the grid. So I believe that the Atlanteans were here to enlighten our species. They upgraded us. They were trying to give us the gift of intelligence and actually take us all the way to the finish line, to take us to paradise. And they were going to do this by teaching us a 7-step path to enlightenment. I described that path in a fictional novel called The Math Wizard because I'm not 100% sure I have this exactly right, but I was able to extrapolate it based on information that I obtained in the course of doing my research. And you will see in the course of hidden history that just a moment.
No worries.
It appears as if 3 of the Great Pyramids were completed. So there was the one that was at Giza. There was one that was in the capital of Atlantis and Poseidonus. There was the one that was located in the Pacific Ocean. I believe all 3 of those were completed, and that the path intended for humanity was based primarily on 3 things. 1, a city and rings. And in the city and rings, you would learn the 10 basics of civilization and how they would be optimized. The 10 basics of civilization are in order: water, sanitation, food, shelter, power, heating, cooling, lighting, telecommunication, and transportation. You would be taught all of those in such a way that the aura, or the energy field that's coming off your body, was optimized. Your light was optimized. The next step would be to go through the 7-step path to enlightenment in a cubical temple. Now, in Bushby's writing, Secret in the Bible, he mentions a cubical temple that used to exist on Giza. Where is it now? It's, according to Bushby, it's been covered over by the second pyramid, which is not a great pyramid. And that is where that particular place of learning went. But we do know about a 7-step path to learning that he was describing in there, and I'll return to that briefly. And then finally, there was the Great Pyramid itself, which was not just a physical device, but also part of a spiritual path. This was what was offered to the demigods once they had been created. The first of the demigods was Atlas. Some people believe that Atlantis itself takes its name from Atlas. So I believe the Pleiadians came down, upgraded the extant ape hominids, created our species Homo sapiens. Poseidon then mates with Cleito at approximately 30,000 BC. There's a new upgrade to create this demigod line that starts with Atlas, eventually results in the Cro-Magnon Man. And unfortunately, it appears as if the reptiles infiltrated Atlantis. So the reptiles can shapeshift, according to multiple authors. David Icke is the most famous. He talks about shapeshifting reptilians. Now, the first time I heard that, I said to myself, okay, that makes no sense to me. I studied a lot of zoology. I've never heard of animals shapeshifting before. Camouflage, yes. There's all kinds of examples of animals who have camouflage via chromatophores, but shapeshifting, no. So I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe this is true, though, because Icke isn't just pulling this out of his translations of ancient writings. He's talking about individuals that he's run into who said that they actually saw world leaders shapeshifting into reptiles. There are people who say that they were present at ceremonies where they saw people shapeshifting into reptiles. So then I thought to myself, okay, well, let's just run with this for a second. Let's try to think about this logically. How could this possibly be happening? So the next thing I thought was, okay, it's technological. You know, maybe they have some like gizmo that's attached to their bodies and they project a hologram and it makes it seem like they're shapeshifting and the rest of this stuff. So I was running with that for a while. And then the more I studied, the more that began to seem implausible. And it began to appear as if, no, this is actually something that they're doing biologically. And then I got even more frustrated and I started saying, well, again, how is this possible? I've never seen any animal on Earth shapeshifts. How could they do this? So then I said to myself one day when I was doing research, are there any animals on Earth that can actually shapeshift? And I plugged it in and I was led to, yes, actually, there is a creature on Earth that can shapeshift just like these reptilians can. And I was amazed. And so I pulled this thing up. I started watching videos of it. And I was starting to get a little freaked out. But I said, okay, I guess this actually is possible. The name of the creature is the mimic octopus. So you can do all the research you want on this creature. Very, very bizarre. Never seen anything like it before. There are a lot of YouTube videos on it. You can see it shapeshift, becoming one species after another species after another. And it doesn't just imitate their shape. It imitates their actual behavior, which is even weirder.
And their texture too. Like it can go up. Yeah, a cuttlefish, right, can just like sit on a rock and then change its skin, not only to the color of that rock, but the texture of that rock.
Exactly. And when I was trying to understand this, I said to myself, okay, I'm too scientific. I need something. You got to give me something. Tell me that someone's done some anatomy, some dissections. They figured out something. And yes, so I have a link to the scientists who actually studied the mimic octopus, and they discovered things that I've never heard of before. So what I have heard of before are chromatophores. Chromatophores are the ability to change color. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's
chameleons.
Classic.
Yeah.
Anoles, fish.
Yeah.
All right. And then the structures that were new were called iridophores and leucophores. Those I had never heard of. And I'm not even going to get into that because we have too much ground to cover. But you can look up what those structures do by following the links. So yes, there actually is a possibility that there is a species that could shapeshift. And now we have to go back to Casey's writing where he talks about an entity, a dark entity called Belial, who infiltrated Atlantis. So Casey talks about this dark being and his followers called the Sons of Belial infiltrating Atlantis, leading the demigods down a dark path. This is confirmed, of course, by Plato's actual dialogue, where he talks about what the princes of Atlantis did. In what's supposed to be a sacred university or temple teaching the path to enlightenment, the princes of Atlantis gathered. They gathered a bull. They sacrificed the bull. They took its blood and they threw it on a sacred pillar. They drank the blood. They burned the bull. None of this behavior sounds positive to me, and it sounds as if that these people were taught the basics, the rudimentaries of devil worship by Belial. So at this point, you could say, well, maybe Casey believes that, but what evidence is there actually to reinforce what he's saying? Well, Edgar Casey, after describing tons of forms of technology he had never seen before, but would eventually manifest in real life, from radio to television to advanced resonant Great Pyramids, which I'm describing, he dies in 1945. The Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered in 1947. And what do the Dead Sea Scrolls talk of? A being named Belial, who is described as reptilian and the Prince of Darkness. What an amazing coincidence that they used the exact same name that Casey used after dying 2 years earlier. So Atlantis then goes to the dark side, as another dialogue of Plato describes. The forces from Arian, which is the island. Atlantis was eventually broken up into multiple islands. The island to the east was known as Arian. Once the forces had gone to the dark side, they created a military force, which then tried to invade the colonies in the Mediterranean basin and take them over. But no such luck. There was an Atlantean legacy colony in what would be known as ancient Greece. Now, by ancient Greece, I mean truly ancient Greece. I mean the time frame of greater than 9600 BC. There was a colony there in the Peloponnese that was known as the Pelasgians or the Arcadians. And Athena, an ancient Athena, because there was actually a more modern Athena, that's part of the confusing story, but there was an ancient Athena who led the Arcadians against the invasion force from the Aryans of Atlantis and defended the Atlantean colonies and staved off that takeover from Atlantis. However, this is where the story takes a very bizarre turn. And at first, when I first heard this story, I thought, okay, I'm not sure I can ever mention this, because if I say this, everyone's going to attack me. But I came across this information first from Shadow of Atlantis by Brzezinski, and he mentioned a tribe called the Pre-Selenites. And according to the Pre-Selenites, there was a time on the Earth before the moon was here and humans were on the Earth. And I thought, okay, never heard that before. And then he goes on to say that the Egyptian records were much deeper and more thorough than anyone had imagined, and that they had a lunar calendar that only went back 11,000 years. And then I came across the following link. So if you go to a search engine, you can type in the following phrase: the scariest book of all time. And if you type in that phrase, it'll take you to a page which offers as much science as Van Flandern offers in the exploded planet hypothesis.
So I'm
to
getting
support
like The Exorcist, Salem's Lot. What am I looking for here?
scariest book of all time.
Yep.
It's just going to be a link. If you use that phrase, it's going to take you to a link that will describe that the moon actually arrived approximately 11,000 years ago.
Okay.
Okay, so once I had that, I said, okay, let me see if I can find more reinforcement for this than what Brzezinski is talking about. And actually, believe it or not, the reinforcement comes from everywhere. So all the major ancient voices that were well known and well respected actually all agreed that the Arcadians were indeed a people before the moon. So among the people who make this claim are Aristotle, Anaxagoras, Democritus, who was the first person to tell us that life is made of atoms, Apollonius of Rhodes, Plutarch, Ovid, and the list goes on. Now, these people, of course, are mainly Europeans, so some people may say, well, If only Europeans are saying that, that doesn't make any sense, because obviously everyone on the whole planet would have known if the moon was not there and then it suddenly appeared. So there should be traditions and oral traditions for tribes all over the world. However, there actually are such traditions. Apparently, the people in North Alaska state that there was a time before the moon. The Chibchas in South America say that there was a time before the moon. This eventually led me to a new search word, which you can plug into Wikipedia. Pro-Selenos. Pro-Selenos. And you can first, get your feet wet looking at all the different people who believe that there was this time before the moon. And then when we look at the arrival of the moon, it tends to correspond to a comet storm, which took down Atlantis. So now we have the final fall of Atlantis at approximately 9600 BC, exactly like what Plato described. And all of these people are getting their information from the same source. This is very important. When people think about a lot of these ancient scholars, they're thinking, okay, well, how's this guy in Greece going to know this? How is Thales of Miletus going to know all this stuff? They're getting their information from the same source, which is Giza and the mystery school that was there. I mentioned earlier that there was a path in Atlantis to enlightenment that was being taught. Well, this was being taught by great pyramids that had this 7-step path. And all of these ancient figures who many of us revere, whether it's Plato or Socrates or Aristotle or Thales or Herodotus, the historian that I mentioned before,
right,
they were all initiated in the Great Pyramid in Egypt, in the mystery school. The first emperor, the first Roman emperor, was initiated in the mystery school of Egypt. According to Tony Bushby in Secret of the Bible, all the pharaohs in all the dynasties were initiated in the Great Pyramid mystery school. And they were taught through a 7-step path. And Bushby describes that path as follows. Step 1, physical sciences. Step 2, geometry and architecture. Step 3, language and hieroglyphics. Step 4, laws. Step 5, chemistry. Step 6, astronomy. And step 7, final revelation. In final revelation, I can only talk about the negative version at this point because in relation to Giza, almost everything had become negative at that point. But they use psychotropic drugs. And this is clear from the research. Specifically, they used the Amanita muscaria mushroom, they used the blue lotus, and they used extracts from pine cones to create psychotropic states. And these would lead to the separation of the soul from the body. So in the 7th degree, final revelation, they had an experience of what was called theophany, or the revelation of the gods, where the soul would leave the body and encounter beings on different frequencies, whether they were positive or negative, depending on how you attuned yourself in the rites. So this is what Giza was capable of doing. And as I mentioned before, it appears as if the Cyanians were in charge of Giza up until the 11,000s. And then I think they went underground. Now, everything underneath Giza is carved out. There's tunnel networks. There's actual cities that exist below the Giza plateau. No human beings could have carved them out. They're gigantic. Herodotus describes them. They're in the reference books that I mentioned. But when the moon arrives, it appears not to just be a moon, and it appears to be a space station. And it appears to be a reptilian space station that was part of a plan to take over the planet. So the planet was pretty wrecked when Atlantis fell, and there's a pause in the story until Sumer gets founded. And the next reference that I used very heavily was actually not Sitchin. It was R.A. Boulay and his book, Flying Serpents and Dragons. Now, I found a number of errors in his work, which I think is okay. He was doing the best that he could do. But he drew on more sources than anyone else I've heard of. And, with your background, I'd love, if you haven't read his book, if you read it, I'd really like to get your feedback on it, since you sound very knowledgeable on the subject. So
putting a star next to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in any case, he drew on multitudes of sources, not just the Bible sources, but he drew on the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Pseudepigrapha, the Apocrypha, tons of other sources to put together his information talking about reptiles founding Sumer. This eventually leads us to what I call the Reptile-Cyanian War, because this was an operation to take over planet Earth and conquer it. And I believe that as you look at the pattern of evidence flowing along, this was the reptilian plan to take over planet Earth. And this shows you hints of the prior cosmic war. In other words, once again, the reptiles seem to be up to their same old tricks, conquer another planet and do it the exact same way that they always do it. The positive path is defined by harmony with nature. The negative path is defined by conquest of nature. And when you look at what is suggested in the psychic readings of Edgar Cayce, it all sounds as if the sons of Belial were trying to wage this campaign of ideas, which is largely in the spirit of you need to conquer nature. You don't work in harmony with it. And the Sumer group, the reptilian group that founded Sumer, clearly seemed to believe that Giza was its greatest threat. So it conceives a multi-part plan. So the reptiles do not appear to be comfortable living on the surface of the earth. They're not adapted to it. They need a hybrid group to serve as surface administrators, a group that actually can walk around in somewhat comfort on the surface of the earth. So it is my belief, based on everything that I've studied, that the Anunnaki were created specifically as a hybrid group that could stand on the surface of the earth and walk around. They were a hybrid group that was a mixture, quite possibly, of Pleiadians as well as Cyanians. So why would I say that they were a mixture of Cyanians? Because that's how they're depicted, with elongated skulls as well. And if you look at the website mesopotamiangods.com, which gives you a great overview for the novice or the newcomer to the Sumerian Anunnaki, you'll see Enki and Enlil and Anu and all the rest of them. There are a lot of carvings that are there. And in the early carvings, you actually see Enki with 2 legs and a tail like a fish. Well, that's the exact match description of the lower body of a Cyanian. The upper body looks very different. And if you look at the Babylonian records, they make reference not to Anunnaki, but another group called the Anadoti. But if you trace through everything linguistically, they're making reference to the same group. They describe their appearance as repulsive abominations. And it appears very much to be accurate, because if you track through the stories to their roots, another source I will mention that can be extremely useful to the researcher, supposedly this is one of the most popular websites on the planet for understanding the ancient past, specifically in relation to the Bible. It's called BibleOrigins.net. And when you go there, you can see the original Sumerian writings as they've been translated into English, of course, the fragments, and then you can track through space and time how those stories got twisted into what would eventually become the Bible. So
BibleOrigins.net doesn't go anywhere.
Okay, do you have a hyphen between Bible and Origins?
I can throw that in there if that's correct. Also goes nowhere.
Okay, try just a search for Bible Origins, and then type the name Reiner, Reiner, and see if that gets you anywhere.
Reiner.
That's his first name, the guy who created the website.
Okay, Reiner name meaning, I'm finding that. Seems like, okay, Reiner name meaning, and then it comes from ourbibleHeritage.com.
Okay, yeah, but I just meant that's the
it.
name of the guy who created the website. The website should be BibleOrigins.net.
Search it real quick and see if you could just grab the link out of your browser and send it to the chat. I'll make sure it gets into the show notes.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Let me do that later, just so I don't interrupt the stream. But I'll definitely find that link.
I'll make a note for us to, after we're done. I'll probably need to grab some of these author names and such from you. So we'll just do that together.
Sounds great.
Cool.
Okay, so this leads us to R.A. Boulay's statement that, according to him, and again, you can double check it, he states that the oldest Sumerian tablet states, "Verily the reptiles descend." And this is before the time of Enki, he points out. So when we track the information that's provided to us by Boulay, he describes the reptiles arriving in a swamp in the Sumer region. They drain the swamp. They create 5 administrative cities. The most prominent of these cities is called Eridu. And as Boulay builds the case, which is strongly reinforced by multiple sources, the site of Eridu is clearly the best possible candidate for what is described in the Bible as the Garden of Eden. And the creation of Adam is actually the creation of the first of the Nephilim. This is going to be the first of the hybrid warrior class that is intended to be used on the surface of the earth for this plan of world conquest that will be led by these Anunnaki hybrids and overseen by other groups. A reptilian ground forces, which are known as the Seraphim, and the reptiles on high, as I sometimes call them, that are also known as the Elohim. So these groups are going
Just
to
the
oversee.
name for God given in the book of Genesis and Hebrew.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
And again, note, and since you're a linguist, you can probably back me up on this one. Elohim is not a singular word; it is plural.
It is absolutely a plural word, meaning if you read it in Hebrew and translate it directly into English, it would be the gods or gods. It would not be God.
Yes.
We could do a whole separate podcast on that subject. So, yeah.
Okay, so the Sumer group then is trying to get itself ready to prepare to launch an assault on Giza, so that this planet will be taken over, because Giza represents clearly the greatest threat. So it takes them a while to get oriented and situated. When they're eventually ready, they send their emissary, who I believe is Seth, who is identified in the Bible as the third son of Adam.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that Seth is actually identical to the mythological being in Egyptian mythology called Set.
Yes.
And then Set arrives in Egypt with a plan to see what he can do to take down Giza. I believe that there was a plan for him to go in and see if he could subvert it and get Giza under Sumer's control. And that plan does not apparently go too well. And eventually, a decision is made to launch a war. So this is a war I describe as the Reptile-Cyanian War. I have estimated it, based on my best guess, at 3400 BC. This war is evidently encoded into the Mahabharata. Now, this is a somewhat complicated story. Again, we probably won't necessarily, even with all the luxurious time you're giving me here to develop this grand story, we probably won't have time to get into every last detail. But there was a scholar.
I will talk to you all night if you want to talk, but we could also do a part 2. That's no big deal.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
But when I was trying to piece this story together of the Reptile-Cyanian War, we had one of the first references was David Hatcher Childress, who wrote a popular article called "Evidence for Ancient Atomic Warfare." Now, of course, when the atomic warfare was developed in the 20th century, there was a famous statement, this is the first time such a weapon has gone off, and Oppenheimer, famously quipped, in modern times.
Mm-hmm.
And the statement then was made, oh, yes, he's a Sanskrit scholar, meaning that he knew that, probably in ancient times there were also nuclear weapons that were deployed. Now, the story of the Reptile-Cyanian War, the evidence for it does show to a significant extent in Evidence for Ancient Atomic Warfare article that you can find if you dig from David Hatcher Childress online. But beyond that, there's another exotic source. I will mention that I used it as a source, but that it was an extremely difficult book to read. So I'm not going to strongly recommend this book, but if people are, if they have the fortitude to wade through some of the stuff that I have to wade through sometimes, you're welcome to read the book called The Greatest Story Never Told by Dr. Lana Cantrell. She makes an effort, which I think is only partially successful, but still somewhat interesting, in showing the correlations between the Mahabharata and events in Egypt. But on much safer ground, we had a somewhat irritated scholar who did essential work. His name is von Mondiam. That's Mandyam, who did a scholarly presentation showing his frustration in revealing that the Mahabharata is really a story that is not based on events centered in India. It is actually simply a recasting of the myth of Osiris, Horus, and Set into an Indian context. What he shows in his writing, and I reproduce his writing in Hidden History of Humanity, is a 16-point correlation between the myth of Osiris and Set and the story in the Mahabharata. So this story was completely plagiarized. And this is not the first time this is going to happen either. We'll see this pattern is going to be repeated over and over again.
You're listening to KEEP in the Keep. Whatever happened to the good old days, when computer role-playing games spent more time telling great stories than stressing you out with season passes and needless grinding? Call of Seregnar is our effort to bring back the best in RPGs. Play in the immersive world as two friends adventure into a murder mystery that lands them in the middle of a battle between gods. Head over to callofseregnar.com. That's call of SAREGNAR.com for more info. And be sure to wishlist on Steam.
But basically what it leads us to is the following. Sumer fought a war to take down Giza. They won the war. After the war was over, it is my belief that hieroglyphics had their origin at that time because the people of Sumer did not speak the language of the native Egyptians. There was a massive communication barrier. So therefore, they had to find some kind of way to communicate. And it is my belief that hieroglyphics were forced into existence as a picture language so that these two groups, very different from each other, had the ability to communicate with each other. Once Sumer had won the war, they wanted to know what the people of Giza knew. And once they found out what the people of Giza knew, they then wanted to shut down as much of it as possible so that human beings would never know their true origins and that they would never really have that full chance to get all the way to the path to enlightenment that the Pleiadians offered. All of history was to be altered. Everything about that had gone before it in relation to Atlantis was to be eliminated. No one was supposed to know that we ever came originally from the Pleiadians. We were all supposed to believe that we came from these, what R.A. Boulay calls Homo saurians, that began with Adam. But according to the research that I present very strongly, Adam was not the first human being. The first human being came into existence, I believe, about 210,000 years ago. The first Cro-Magnon came into existence approximately 30,000 years ago. Adam, who probably came into existence approximately 4,000 BC, give or take, was the first of the Homo saurian bloodline. Now, part of the evidence that actually reinforces this is a strange skin condition. And I wanted to find evidence along these lines to help ground this information as much as I possibly could. So what I was led to is a skin condition that is called ichthyosis, which basically means fish skin. So you can look that up at Wikipedia. And what you will find is that ichthyosis does not result from you eating a bad hot dog or something like that. It actually is a genetic aberration. So it's not something that you acquire. And where do people have ichthyosis? Tends to be in the areas wherever these reptilian Homo saurians were once active. After these hybrids have become well spread, there is a transition in the Cyanian bloodline. So what happens there is the creation of what are called the Horites. Now, Horites are definitely described in the ancient literature by multiple sources, but the nature of the Horites is not really expressed by too many people outside of Bushby. So in Secret in the Bible by Bushby, he mentions the true origin of the Horites, which ties into the myth of Set and Osiris. So what happens there is that there's a story of a rape or a possible recreation of a species. In the Egyptian mythology, the story goes that Isis resurrects Osiris through his penis, which is a very bizarre story to tell. But I believe that that is a mythological encoding of the fact that the seeds from the Cyanians were taken and turned into a new hybrid group called Horites. Now, the reason why this would be known as a new hybrid group for sure seems to mark the transition from Cyanians having hemocyanin as a blood carrier and transitioning to them to having hemoglobin. However, they still have very warped and strange bodies, as Bushby describes. So what Bushby describes is the uncovering of giant skeletons called the followers of Horus. These men stood like giants. They had elongated skulls, and apparently they still had some vestigial hermaphroditic characteristics. Now, for people who find this implausible, and I totally understand if people do find it implausible, you're led to another mystery, which is one of the most diabolical figures in all hidden history of humanity, is an individual by the name of Akhenaten. And when you look up Akhenaten and look at his body, you will see things that are very, very strange. One, his skull is extremely elongated. Two, he is often depicted as a male with breasts. Now, some people say, oh, well, he had Marfan syndrome. He had, this or that strange genetic anomaly. Oh, yeah, well, maybe. Or maybe he's actually another hybrid line that was created to now administer Egypt. So it is my belief that the Sumerians were actually behind the Egyptian dynasties, ruling from the shadows. Please note that when the Egyptian dynasties get started, they immediately imposed a crocodile-headed god named Sobek, as if they were trying to get the Egyptians to worship reptiles from the very beginning. And I believe that Egypt was ruled from the shadows the entire time by the Sumerians, who gutted the mystery school and made sure that the path to enlightenment was lost, and eventually they would create the world's major religions. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to give that overview before we took the conversation other directions. But I had a feeling that if I didn't give that overview, we were eventually going to be led back to it one way or another. And I will gladly yield, drink some water, and you can take the conversation wherever you would like to go for a little bit.
Let's take a little bathroom break, actually, and then come back to it.
Sounds great.
All right. Pausing. So, like, the first thing, there's so much to touch on here, but I'm just going to kind of like let it flow. The first thing that really comes to mind is we talked about, there's always the serpent and the eagle stuff, between the Atlanteans and whoever the archons, as David Icke would say, Enki and Enlil, they always get brought up. Where do you think the archetype for like the antlered or goat headed person comes from, like Pan or El Qadir, that kind of stuff?
In my opinion, it is strongly linked to Enki.
Okay.
He is a primary figure, and we notice with the mystery rite rituals, they do tend to they love December 22nd, that time of year. Why? Because it's the darkest time of the year. And if you look at the zodiac, you will see Capricorn in that sign. Capricorn, also known as the goat fish, and in R.A. Boulet's writing Flying Serpents and Dragons, the goatfish does seem to be his symbol. So it just, all of it in these dark traditions ultimately does trace back to what appears to be an otherworldly diabolical force, or the devil, for lack of a better word. And it seems that everyone in this tradition, one way or another, worships the devil, and their primary modus operandi is always to do the opposite of what nature does, in the spirit of conquering nature. So anything at all that is natural, they want you strongly and passionately to do the exact opposite of that.
It's really interesting because, Pan being the god of nature, and like the modern day, well, I say modern day, but the last 2,000 years worth of depiction of the devil, mostly because of, I would say, the Christians moving into Europe and then adapting to what the pagans there believed, right? Depict the devil as this horned figure who is in fact the god of nature to the pagans, right?
Right.
You
Yes.
have Baphomet as well, if you want to go to the Knights Templar, the Masonic, point of view. But
yeah, I think it all traces back to the same source.
yeah, it all gets very, very confused as you try to unravel the story there. So, like, when did this begin for you? This whole venture?
Okay, so that's a little bit difficult to dissect. I can tell you that from the time I was a little kid, I just had this insatiable desire to acquire as much knowledge as possible. And mainly that was because I was living in negative circumstances, and I wanted to change the negative into positive. And I figured if I learned as much as possible, I could figure out how to move in a most positive direction. And then I was prepping to write this 20 novel saga, which was supposed to be, the greatest saga ever written. And I was doing all this research to have verisimilitude. So I didn't just want to write, make it up fiction. I wanted to have everything resting on a sound historical basis, so it felt real and the readers felt like they were being empowered as they were reading it. And then I went through my life and I was doing a whole bunch of different things, had plenty of detours with the creation of the 3D periodic table of the elements, new theory of the origin of species, all these other different things that happened. But after I had done the work in the 3D periodic table of the elements, I got support from scientists all over the world. Like 95% of them were supportive in like 35 different, 95% of them were supportive in about 30 different countries. And then the journalists didn't want anything to do with me. And I said, what? And I said, look, I have support from a lot of different scientists. All you need to do is just read this information. They said, no, we don't even want to read it. And I said, okay, why not? And then they would tell me stuff about peer review. And I said, yes, you want to throw peer review at me, that's fine. My peers are anybody who's graduated high school, because basically to understand the work that I did, you don't have to be an expert. All you have to do is understand how to apply basic geometric skills. So I published the paper for free at my website. People can go read it right now if they want to. It's called Beauty of the Atom. But in any case, once I saw that there was a lot of suppression going on. That got me frustrated. So I started researching global corruption. That led me to the book Suppressed Inventions and Other Discoveries by Jonathan Eisen, one of the most important books I ever read. And once I read that book, I realized the planet that I was living on, which is that you don't celebrate great ideas. You try to crush them, you try to kill the inventor. There's a small group of people that are hell-bent on having power over the rest of us. And then I started tracing the origins of that more fully. Of course, tons of books came out in the 90s. I was reading as many of those as I could. And then I was watching the events, of course, during the last several years. And that's when I finally started saying to myself, as other people were saying to me too, you should probably write a book with all the stuff that you've discovered. So then I started working on putting an outline together. Originally, I was thinking I would just cite all the source material, but some of the sources are not necessarily the best writers. And I had won awards for my writing all my life. And I was noticing, yeah, probably if I re-explain this in my own words, it'll be clearer to people as I go through the story. So then I was originally thinking I was going to write a book that was, maybe 200 pages. And then I ended up with a book that was 777 pages in the interior.
Right. You said you grew up in like not really great circumstances. Like, what was going on?
It was just a lot of, I'm trying to even think of what to say here. It just was not a positive environment. It's not something I necessarily want to get into that much because it's not really important. The important thing was just that I learned how to be positive, and I wanted to not be in that environment, and just see what was possible in relation to optimal civilization. Because one of the things that I noticed eventually is, I'm certainly not the first person in the history of the world to grow up in an abusive environment, but when you look at abuse as a big picture, you start seeing trends and patterns. Like one of the biggest patterns and trends in relation to it is that there's employment situations or just the general setup of a society where people are forced to do work that they don't really want to do. And one of the things that emerged from all this research is if we set up an optimal civilization, we actually could have people living on independent homesteads where all their needs are met, where they have their own water, sanitation, food, shelter, power, heating, cooling, lighting, telecommunication, transportation. They're taking care of all of that on their own homestead. So once they have that, then they can live the lives that they want to live, doing what they love to do all their days. And to me, that's the most important thing.
Gotcha. What's your lifestyle these days?
Trying to survive, actually, because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and she made the comment, out of all the people that I know, you're the least conformist person, and that's probably true. I can see why she would believe that. But when you don't conform, everyone I know who has conformed more than I have is way more financially successful.
Right.
So that's frustrating. But when I think about the quality of the work that I've done, whether it's, creating the three-dimensional periodic table of the elements, new theory of the origins of species, writing hidden history of humanity, doing all the fictional novels that I've written that were uncompromising and just genuinely telling the truth as I believe it to be, and reinforced by evidence, I'm glad that I have not conformed, because I can look back on my life and I can say, you wanted to find out what happened if you didn't conform, and this is the life that you live. And it's been extremely difficult, but I'm glad, again, that I've chosen to live this way. When you go through Hidden History of Humanity, one of the big things you see so many times are people selling their souls in different ways, sometimes literally. And it's an important thing, I think, to hold on to your soul, because, in the end, that's going to matter. And I also like to believe, especially based on all the stuff that I've uncovered in History of Humanity, that life is a tuning process, so that there exist other realms of existence on other frequencies, kind of like radio stations. And if you live a life that is truly positive, no matter how much negativity you're experiencing or how much adversity you're experiencing, it's my belief that next lifetime I will tune to a higher frequency. And if I can do that, then I feel like I've lived the correct life, no matter how much adversity I've gone through.
So how can someone purchase your books?
They would just go to my website. Originally, I had a few books on Amazon. Actually, it's possible that some of them are actually still on Amazon. They were
I'm not
trying.
seeing you on Amazon. I am looking at your website and like I can't necessarily click on a book and grab it. I do see your ordering page, but then it just says basically that you can.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So if you go to the website, my website, Polytope Press website,
Yeah.
if you find a book that you want on a given page, the books are usually described with details in reviews in the sections of the website. Like if you go on the science page, there are the books that are related to science, technology for technology, history for history. If you click on the order now, it'll take you to the ordering page. So all you have to do is just use that information and write me, tell me which books you want, and I'll put together an invoice, or you can purchase through PayPal if you want to do that. And then you can purchase books that way.
Right. We got to make this easier for you, mate. This is too much work.
That's very generous of you. Like I said, I'm doing the best I can, and if I told you the stories of what happens when you don't conform and when you're resisting this stuff, I mean, I have had publishers disappear. I've had printers disappear. I've had stuff be lost in the mail. I've had payment companies that were, yeah, okay, everything's great. And then I had a huge transaction with this one customer who bought multiple books. And next thing I knew, I saw a message in my email inbox saying, we cannot process this transaction. And I said, why not? And then it took a long time for someone to respond. And then they said, we've decided we're no longer going to work with any of your products. We're not going to give you an explanation. Our decision is final. Bye. And I was like, what? So, I mean, this is the kind of world I've been living in for a long period of time. And with the other researchers who I often mention, most of those were murdered. Some of them were imprisoned. And during the last several years, like in the health field, several people I know, I was just having this discussion with another podcast host who decided not to have me on. She was thinking about having me on until she was asking me questions about my situation. And I was saying, okay, do you know Dr. Zev Zelenko? He had some excellent ideas on health, and he was joking with another doctor that they were on a hit list. And shortly after that, he was removed from the world. And there's several other people who do the exact same thing. They've either been poisoned, they're hit with energy weapons. I mean, I'm not expecting to die a natural death. I know that's usually what happens when you do this kind of thing. I'm just doing the best I can. And if I do have more resources, I'll be happy to improve the look and the feel of every single thing that I'm doing. But for now, I'm just lucky if I can breathe.
Interesting. Are you on the move?
No, no, I'm stable. But one of the things that Dr. Shiva taught me, he was one of not taught me directly. I saw a video of his presentations. He put this big video up on the screen during the debates on whether or not we were having election fraud. And he said that he uncovered pretty much the manual that the bad guys use to determine who to take out and who not to take out. And I was like, oh, okay, this is good information for me. Let me listen to what he has to say. So he said that there were 3 primary characteristics that the bad guys use in determining who to take out. So criteria number 1, you have to be credible. So I got a checkbox for that one. And then criteria number 2, you have to have a ton of money. Well, I don't have a ton of money. And then criteria number 3, you have to have an enormous following. And I have a small following. I do not have an enormous following. So at this point, I'm allowed to stay alive for those reasons. But if I ever hit those other characteristics, I assume I'll be taken out. But at the same time, as many people have pointed out, if you look carefully at what's going on, for example, just yesterday I was listening to Dane Wigington at geoengineeringwatch.org was doing an interview, and he said that the situation with the biocide that is going on planet Earth right now, which is orchestrated by the same group that began in Sumer, the biocide is so great that he projects that the planet has 3 years to survive if we stay on the trajectory that we're on. So for anyone who says, well, maybe if you stop conforming, you'll have a wonderful life. No, I won't. I mean, if we don't resist as human beings, our species will be gone. We'll be turned into cyborgs, and we could be taken out by the pollution that's being dumped on us and is infiltrating our soil, our food, our water. There's no choice but to resist. It's the only chance that you have. And like I said, there's no guarantee I'm going to live, but there's no guarantee you're going to live anyway. So do the best you can.
You said you've known people who've been taken out with energy weapons. Can you describe that?
Okay, so there are a few different researchers. One I had mentioned not that long ago that Dr. Zlenko was joking with Dr. Artis about them being at the top of a hit list. Well, after they were having that laugh, and Dr. Zlenko was taken out, Dr. Artis kept going, and he told a story in an interview that very, very strange. I was at my house and I saw that I had this bonus water bottles showed up at my house, and I was thinking, okay, where did this come from? And I started tracking it down, and it turned out that that was poisoned water that had been sent to my home, and they thought I was going to drink it, but fortunately I didn't drink it. But so he wasn't taken out that way. But then Dr. Artis has been going around. He's been just a fantastic researcher, one of the premier leaders in natural health these last several years. And he was lecturing on stage, and he was apparently hit with an energy weapon of some kind. And he said he got intensely sick, and he had to leave the stage, and he went into a bathroom. But his natural healing skills are so extreme, he was actually able to recover, and he's still alive. So in his particular case, he was not taken out, but he was hit by one. So I assume that if you are a high caliber individual and you're going to lecture in public, that they will hit you with energy weapons to take you off the stage.
So why wouldn't the shooter that tried to take out the president when he was running? Why didn't he use an energy weapon? You know what I'm saying? Like, if they're willing to do that in front of people.
Oh, you have to break down each particular incident. So some of the stuff that you see with official people being taken out is actually just theater. It's not necessarily real. So again, you have to go on a case by case basis. Like I said, for me, I'm living in the twilight zone. Almost this entire reality to me is fake. Almost everything I see is fake. I just do so much research, hoping that I'm at least getting in the ballpark of what is actually true. But I never know. I know that I can tell you stories of a pope that has given a speech from a balcony, and it was actually a hologram. I can tell you stories of robots that appear lifelike. I can tell you stories of the state of the art with latex masks where actors can portray world leaders and they're not actually that world leader who's long since gone. I can tell you of what are called crisis actors who go from one set to another, and there's, let's say, a mass shooting event or there's an explosion, and the same actor shows up in the same place telling you, oh my gosh, this terrible thing just happened. I guess we should go along with these new laws that strip away our freedom and our security because we'll all be safer that way. So, I mean, like I said, this whole reality, I'm not 100% sure what I'm seeing when I look at an event where a supposed political leader has been taken out. I will tell you, for example, that there is an individual who is very popular in the news, who supposedly had a lot of information about sex trafficking and was imprisoned in a New York prison and supposedly committed suicide, and that there is supposed footage of him being alive and well in Israel, and that our government is currently saying that he did commit suicide. So again, I have no idea 100% what's real or what's not. I gather my evidence. I put together a story that's most plausible. And at this point, I've thought about the most intelligent way of going about things for moving in the direction of optimal civilization. I put that into my fiction. But one of the things that I thought about many, many years ago is that there's sort of a right way, a most probable way of doing this in a way that would be successful. And that would be to find out basically who else on the planet cares about human beings, who else has the dedication to want to put in the time and the energy to understand the world we're living in and to understand the kinds of technology we would need to form what is called a breakaway civilization. And what I found out my whole life, like I remember going through my teen years, I was doing a lot of research into what was going on in the world. I was focusing on some of the darkest events in history because I wanted to understand what their origins were so that those two could be transcended. And when I would look to my peers, like, okay, so what are you guys interested in? Let's get drunk. Okay. So I, because of the way I grew up, I was not going to get drunk. So I said, well, if you want to escape this reality, that's fine. I'm a confrontationalist. I want to know the reality that I'm living in. I want to change it for the better. And so when I would look around, I would see people who were just kind of looking back at me with these eyes of, I just want a paycheck, man. I just want to be able to survive. I'm not necessarily interested in this big picture, not interested in paradise or anything like that. Just let me get through the day. And so I thought, okay, so most of my fellow human beings have checked out of the quest to resist this darkness that has been on the planet for a very long period of time. And then it's just a question of, is there anyone out there? I remember that rock song. Can't say I'm a big fan of that particular rock song, but the lyric that said, "Is anybody out there? Does anybody care?"
Mm.
I remember hearing those lyrics and thinking, that's kind of the way I feel right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my question. Yes, do we have the ability to turn all this around and realize paradise on earth? Can we go back to the original 7-step path to enlightenment that the Pleiadians were offered us and follow through with that? We do have that option, but I can't do it by myself. Some of the things that the bad guys wield at this point include satellite-based beams that can create earthquakes. They can create fires. They can obliterate places like they obliterated Lahaina. Like they can steer weather and obliterate sites like they did in North Carolina, cause earthquakes in Mexico as they did in Turkey.
You say North Carolina, are you referring to the base?
No, I'm referring to the hurricane that was within the last few years.
All right, we can talk about this. And I don't have like a strong stance, but I am extraordinarily skeptical of the idea that we're controlling the weather. I was a weather forecaster in the Air Force for 4 years. So
Oh yeah, no, it's perfectly okay if you're skeptical. But again, I would urge you to follow the research of Dane Wigington at geoengineeringwatch.org and look up the research of Jim Lee. He will track for you, giving you names and dates of specific government programs to control the weather, and he will show you a timeline.
Yeah, I'm aware of this. So
okay,
I'm just saying it would be an extraordinary amount of effort for just what I saw, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like live satellite imagery, like all of the weather stations in the world would have to be compromised and controlled from like a singular point in order for them to.
No, I would say that I would say that that's not true. I would say that sometimes when people are new to the research, they think that way. But when you look more closely at what Wigington has uncovered, there's a multitude of field stations. And there was a recent interview with an individual who talked about the facility that is based in Antarctica, which he said was even stronger than all the other facilities. So that would probably be the closest to a single point. But you combine waves from multiple sources, and they can manipulate the weather. One of the great books I think that would help guide your thinking a little bit on that, if in addition to the previous sources, is the aforementioned Secrets of Cold War Technology from Jerry Vassalatos, because his joke was to understand the 20th century, read Tesla's biography, because basically what they did is, after they killed him, they took his technology and they weaponized it, specifically the electromagnetic waves, because what Tesla was trying to do was switch us over to etheric carrier waves, and they weaponized the electromagnetic waves, ignored all the positive applications of the technology, turned directly to the negative, and developed. I'm just curious, with your skepticism, if you read through, and I do urge you to read through Secrets of Cold War Technology from Vassalatos. Do you have no opinion whatsoever on HARP?
I have opinions about HARP, but I don't think that it's a weather control station. Like,
okay. So one of the things I'll just mention as part of the discussion is at the beginning of Secrets of Cold War Technology, Vassalatos goes on this really long rant, and I think that he really didn't need to go on that long of a rant. But the point that he was getting to is an important one, which is when people start to argue in this arena, you can save a lot of time and energy if you do what Vassalatos did. And that was his point of going on this rant. Instead of speculating about what the technology can do what he did, which is to do patent sweeps. Mm-hmm. So he swept through the patents. He found out exactly what the patents said the technology could do. And then he said, this is what the technology does based on the patents, and then based on his own inside information. So I am not in any way going to object to your skepticism. I'm going to encourage it. I'm going to, add as much fuel to the fire as possible. And then I will say, do the research, check out those sources, and then get back to me. Check out what Dane Wigington has to say. Check out Jim Lee. Check out Secrets of Cold War Technology. And then if you still find it implausible and you can build a strong case, and maybe you'll set me straight. I don't know.
Yeah, it's not really a matter of like trying to convince anybody to believe what I believe or other way around. It's a matter of I worked for the government who pays people 24 hours a day all over the world to figure out what the weather's going to be to protect their own assets, right? So the idea that the United States government or the deep state behind that government, which I do believe is there, I don't think that's even something that needs to be debated. The idea that they would destroy their own assets when they can control the weather and dupe every single person involved in this operation to forecast the weather, it's a lot. It's a whole lot of red tape you would have to put in front of a lot of people in order to completely convince everyone that the data that they're seeing is correct and that somehow they're controlling it and destroying their own things.
As I've gone forward in this research, I was eventually led to a conclusion. So I know that when I was doing my research as a teenager, I was aware that there was a great deal of corruption in the world. And stupid me, I was, I guess, relatively naive at the time.
Mhm.
When I thought about the corruption, I thought about it in simple human terms. I started thinking, oh, okay, that's probably corruption where they're getting extra money on the side, and then they're getting like extra sports cars, and then they're having a lot of mistresses, and they're having all this sex, and they're just having a wild time. That's what this corruption is. And then as you go deeper and deeper, and you start seeing the demonic overtones, and you see the diabolical overtones, and then you start learning about how many children have been abducted, and then you start learning about these rituals and what occurs in these rituals. You're looking at a completely different level of magnitude of corruption that carries you to the point of these people are complete psychopaths that have no conscience, don't care how many people die, don't care about the obliteration of their assets. They are completely gone. So that's where I was led. Maybe you haven't reached that point yet, but if you keep doing the research, maybe you will reach that point. I don't know. I hope you don't.
Well, I mean, I'm open-minded, man. Like, seriously. I wouldn't even be talking to you this long if I wasn't. So I will just say, if, like, hypothetically, they are controlling the weather, but they don't care about anything, right? They just, like, they'll destroy their own things. They're, like, blow a fucking hurricane over their own F-35s. I could see a plausible argument where it's like, maybe the people that we're thinking of as the leadership are negotiating constantly with whatever it is that they're communicating with. And they don't get their way all the time. And then they have to scramble to cover up the conspiracy because they don't want anyone to see that they're communicating with whatever this is. So it's like, oh, darn, well, Hurricane Katrina was a disaster or 9/11 was a disaster. And there was nothing we could do about it. But perhaps they do know that there was, like, someone could have done something about it, but they didn't want to help us out this time. They don't care about us. I don't know.
Yeah, it all seems to be David Icke made a point in the early pages of his book to point out the pyramid idea. That there's really only somebody at the very top who knows what's going on. And if you follow that pyramid to its apex, I think that the apex would lead to an other dimensional negative force that we call the devil. So that's the way I view it. As at the very top of that apex are people who worship the devil, and at the very top of it is the equivalent of the devil who wants you to think that he is God. So much of what has gone on in the ancient religions was trying to convince you that there is a God, and they want you to think in terms of worshiping this God as engaging in acts of sacrifice, that sacrifice is a great and a wonderful thing to make your God happy. It's a current that runs through multiple religions. I grew up Catholic, and I shocked everybody when I was 17 years old because I sort of retreated from the world and I started thinking about my life and who I wanted to become. And I made a bunch of decisions. And one of those decisions was to leave the Catholic faith because I just was never really comfortable with it. But I remember when I was thinking about things, I was just a little disturbed because in Catholicism, you would go to these services called masses, and there would be this altar. It was the focal point of the church, was an altar. And, I started thinking, why is that altar there? Isn't that sort of reminiscent of like people who commit sacrifices on an altar?
Yeah.
And then during the service, there's this guy in a robe who stands up there and he says, this is my flesh, eat my flesh. This is my blood, drink my blood. And, as a kid, I was a little puzzled by that. And I would ask questions like, is this healthy? Is this positive? Or people were, oh, no. It's just symbolic. It's just symbolic. You're not actually eating anyone's flesh. You're not actually drinking any blood. But then I'm thinking, I don't know if that explanation saves you, because it still makes me uncomfortable that we're even symbolically eating flesh and drinking blood.
Yeah.
So when you trace all those origins back, it all kind of bothered me, and I just want to be free of it.
So do you believe in a god?
I do.
Okay. But from what I'm gathering here, like you believe that, at least to some extent, that the Hebrew Elohim or Jehovah is not the one true master of the universe, or the great architect, or something like that.
Most definitely not.
Okay. You really should talk to, maybe I could make it happen where all three of us sit down, but you should talk to Barry Fitzgerald. He's
okay.
Very prominent. Some of the stuff you were talking about earlier about the grid points around the Earth and such, he's actively leading a research team right now, analyzing geospatial satellite data for geomagnetic anomalies on the Earth and coordinating those with areas of high strangeness. You familiar with like the 37th parallel?
I haven't heard that particular parallel mentioned significantly.
The 37th parallel, as in the line of latitude,
right?
Extremely active for what people refer to as high strangeness. Whether that be, I mean, if you're following it along the lines, it goes right through, Area 51, and it cuts across through Hellier, Kentucky, Somerset, Brown Mountain, North Carolina, and also places around the world. But I'm going to be more familiar with the North America, obviously. One of those things. It's just one of those things where, like, you observe strange things like this along that line more than other places. And then you have lines of intersection, which actually, when you're talking about like putting a cube inside of the Earth and finding, you have the Bermuda Triangle. You have, I think there's 10 of these around the world, but the Dragon's Triangle, or the Devil's Sea, these areas are also just below the 37th parallel, like 35th, I want to say.
Yeah, and well, in relation to some of these lines, the 30th in Atlantis, the eighth continent, Charles Berlitz describes that as the pyramid belt, because a lot of the pyramids do seem to fall along the 30th, and the 33rd is sort of well known for assassinations. That's where Kennedy was, and apparently that's where Roosevelt was when he developed a mysterious headache and died.
Lots of strange things happen, and it's interesting because it's also where like the vast majority of weather phenomena happens. In my field of meteorology, we would talk about this in terms of it's got to do with energy, because you have the Coriolis effect, and you have the amount of sunlight hitting the sun during the day, the tilt of the Earth. It all adds up.
You mentioned
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
you mentioned the Coriolis effect. So since you are mentioning Coriolis effect, I would just be curious to hear your take, just for my own benefit. What do you feel about the flat earthers trying to impose their worldview?
I'm more likely to accept that the Earth is a hologram than I am to accept that it's just flat.
Okay.
I think that that's a bunch of people who are either confused or actively trolling, spreading information to deceive us. Like, if I had to categorize ideas into this is an idea spread by the devil and this is an idea spread by the architect, I would say that's on the confuse everyone line. At least within the 4-dimensional mindset that we exist in, the Earth appears to be round. If it's more than that, I'm open to it. If it's less than that, I'm gonna err on the side of advocating for less dimensions than we see is probably evil. More dimensions seems like the solution to that.
Well, I'll go for the oblate spheroid, but again, some of these discussions where they pick the facts that are convenience to them, I just don't know how the flat earthers do they know the Coriolis effect, or do they not know it? And if they, I'm just wondering if they did know of it, would they have an explanation for it, or they just dodged that one?
They seem to just, like I said, it's more of a troll thing. It's like people who don't know a lot. Most of the people who are advocating for this stuff are the kind of person who are like, well, how come you put a ball on the ground and it rolls? How do you, or like, okay, that disproves your own point. So I don't think they can be reasoned with. I think confusion is to use it in human terms, confusing people is evil. Like purposefully doing things that are being confused, being disordered is not a state of near godliness.
Right.
Yeah. The idea is that you are seeking gnosis. I mean, whether you're, I don't know, an initiate into a particular society or whatever that offers you that, or you do it through religious means, or you're a scientist, whatever the case, you're trying to acquire knowledge so that you can put the pieces together. Someone who is fractured, confused, disorderly, appears to have multiple personalities, whatever, like, this is legion. This is demonic.
Right. And for me, going back to the mystery schools, that's one of the important things in relation to the acquisition of knowledge. In the mystery schools, they had a concept they called the archai, which are the design principles of the universe, sort of like the first principles that show us how the universe is ordered. Right. And I would say that those principles apply to the structure of the atom, which I demonstrate in the paper, and they apply to phyllotaxis of leaves, or the arrangement of leaves on a plant stem. They apply to biomechanics. There's a brilliant book by Philip Ball. I tracked his research before he wrote that sort of masterpiece.
Scared of people called Ball. I'm just kidding. What's his book?
His book, the masterpiece book, is called Self-Made Tapestry, and his last name is actually spelled Ball, for the record. But in that book, he strongly reinforces my case that the Darwinian evolutionary model doesn't really stand up, and that we see that there are design principles that have to be honored. Otherwise, like, for just one example of many technical examples I could give, is that, as Galileo pointed out, as you scale something up, volume increases at the third power and surface area increases at the second power. So if an object is scaled up, it's not going to function unless the surface area is somehow made to compensate as the object increases in volume. And that's exactly what nature does.
Sure, this is why Godzilla can't exist.
Yeah. So so again, that's part, where you're just mentioning confusion, and part of what I'm suggesting is like positive, happy vibration is the closer you are to the archive, the less confusion there will be.
Yeah, we talked a little bit earlier about Pan. There's a pretty popular documentary. It's called Hellier, and it's about a group of people who are investigating areas along that 37th parallel I was talking about earlier. And at the end of it, spoiler for all the people who haven't watched it, they end up going into a cave and doing a ritual for Pan to try to bring his rebirth on camera. And I don't know to what extent this is theater or to what extent it is genuinely they're curious, but they are pretty convinced that they're observing a bunch of synchronicities, and the synchronicities have all these dead ends, and that because Pan is a trickster god, that he is leading them to all of these loose ends. But when you come to a dead end and you end up going still along the right path, or at least the path that you're intended to go on, that eventually you're going to get where you're going, and you're just not meant to understand it. And this sounds extraordinarily close to the Old Testament God, right? So that really, there's a lot of parallels there, synchronicities, if you will.
In Harold Wilkins' Secret Cities of Old South America, he talks a little bit about the Pacific continent, and in his view, I don't have as many sources on the civilization that may have existed on Pan as I would like, but one of the things he does say is that he does feel that darkness had entered into that continent and had corrupted a lot of the people, because in his research, it sounds like some of the refugees from the Pacific fled and ended up in South America, and that some of those people, showed signs of coming from a very messed up state of mind. I know he mentions, I was just double checking some of the research that was pointing this out, and it was actually pretty interesting stuff. Because I know one of the sources I cite is Frank Joseph, because his research was reinforced by multiple other sources. But I know that there were some people who didn't like Frank Joseph, so then I was thinking to myself, well, let me double check some of his claims and make sure that they're still holding up pretty well. One of the things he had stated was that he thought one of the major catastrophic events in relation to a lost civilization in the Pacific was a comet pass at 1628 BC. So I thought, okay, well, that's pretty specific. Let me see what I can find on that. Found an Irish scientist who was doing tree ring analysis, and he found that it did indeed correspond to what appears to be a catastrophic comet event in 1628. So that definitely lined up. And then another thing that Joseph had mentioned was the research in relation to megaliths and sites on Tonga. So I said, okay, well, I haven't double checked that particular thing. Let me go check it out. So I went to a site and I saw the megaliths on Tonga, and I saw, yep, just exactly what he described. And, it gets into a lot of esoteric math with the world grid and numbers and calculations that are tied to the Great Pyramid in Giza. But the math is there for people who are into delving into the mathematical aspects of this.
Another one of the things that gets brought up about when you're going to do what do you know about magic? Are you a believer in like ceremonial magic or what?
Oh, okay. So in relation to magic, I will say that the progression I went through in my life was that when I was a kid, I read fantasy, and you hear about that kind of magic and in fantasy stories with wizards doing stuff. And then I got into this, I guess you could call it scientific phase, where I sort of retreated from my openness to mysticism that I had before I was 10. And then I became like really hardcore into science and not really believing too much in anything that was mystical. And then I was led back into the mysticism. And during that entire
what age
stretch,
were you when you were led back into the mysticism?
Early 20s.
Okay.
And as those experiences began to accumulate, I was thinking about magic, and I said to myself, well, it doesn't seem to really resonate too much with me at this point in time, the way it's described. So I'm going to keep that on the back burner. And then eventually I got to the point where I was doing all this research, and then I started seeing all these correlations. And then I said, oh, now I'm beginning to see. And eventually what I was led to was, this is my current understanding. Who knows where it'll be tomorrow? But my current understanding of magic is that it is indeed exactly what I've been talking about in relation to technology, which is ether physics. So ether would be a higher frequency form of energy that is more fundamental than electricity. It's overlapped and existing in the same space as electrical phenomenon. But in order to manipulate the ether, you have to indulge in certain practices that will result in certain results. Like, for example, in ancient Egypt, there is a depiction of a device called a Waz scepter. It is depicted in the hands of a being such as Imhotep, who also, by the way, has blue-green skin in many of his depictions. So what was the Waz scepter? From my research, it appears to be an ether physics device that was capable of doing a number of the things that do occur in mythology. For example, transmutation of elements and the generation of lightning. Whether that lightning was electromagnetic lightning or etheric lightning is another interesting question, because as I cite the work of Vassalatos, he says that Tesla was indeed involved in ether physics in generating etheric lightning, which is different from standard lightning. But the ideas of transmutation, sort of evoke ideas of the magic wand. So in relation to that, I mentioned there's a physicist whose name is Ken Shoulders, whose work was cited in relation to the suppressed invention of Thomas Henry Morey. And what that work showed is that if you got matter into this borderline state of being plasma, if it was hit with a certain vibration, you could transmute elements. So one of the things that's said about magic is that, people would wave their magic wand and this would change into that. Well, I mean, could that be an echo of ether physics, where you've transformed something into plasma and you hit it with a right specific etheric vibration, and so now something has changed into something else? Another story that I mention is in relation to human beings who might have been able to fly. I was asked about this on one of the last podcasts I did. So the story there comes from, once again, Harold Wilkins in Synchronicities of Old South America, where he says that archaeologists discovered something called Klang Platten in the German, you might even be able to do that translation without me doing it, but that would be sound plates that apparently acted as levitation discs. And the story that Wilkins had uncovered was that maybe these were routine in Atlantis, and the way that they worked. There's several people who have talked about this particular concept, although not necessarily applying it to sound discs in Atlantis. But the idea is supposed to be that with the right frequencies, gravity can be negated. So what Wilkins discussed was some of the people in Atlantis, possibly as early as children, would each get a sound disc sort of worn over the chest, like a necklace that would end in a disc over the chest. Each one would have to be individually tuned to the frequency of the individual. And when the right note was struck, gravity would be negated and these people could fly in Atlantis. So if you, I don't know, imagine a flying wizard practicing magic, how would they do that? Maybe they did it through these levitation discs. That would be another way that it theoretically could have been done. But I think one of the most compelling ideas, and it's just amazing to me how some of the things that ended up being most significant in my research actually didn't have anything to do with my recent research. They had to do with little incidental things I came across when I was a kid, and I just happened to retain it in my imagination and in my mind over all these years. But I was growing a lot as an artist when I was growing up, and one of my favorite artists was a guy by the name of Esteban Morado, and I used to get books, just anything that he drew. I wanted to get that book because I liked his artwork so much. So one of the books he illustrated was a book called The Magic Goes Away. It was written by science fiction author Larry Niven. And in that book, there's like an afterword where he gets into the story of magic that is told in there about how magic was going out of the world. And apparently among the Polynesians, one of the most popular words for this magical force that was manipulated is mana. And very interestingly, mana has roots in the Hebrew language. And we can also trace that to
the magical food that they eat along the 40 years that they spend in the desert until they get to the promised land.
And then there's a question of what is the true nature of mana. So as I explore some of the sources that get into this, we're led to two different concepts, which may or may not perfectly overlap. I think that they might very well perfectly overlap. I don't know for sure. But one of the concepts is of course, the Amanita muscaria mushroom, because as a number of the sources who were trying to track down specifics in relation to the gathering of mana and the influence of mana, it sounds as if they were actually gathering mushrooms. But then when you look at the transcendent research of David Radius Hudson, are you familiar with his work?
I'm not. Just one book for the sake of keeping the list brief, but
I don't have that book name. I can tell you that I have a reference to his work is often referenced by an acronym ORME, Orme, which also has strangely interesting etymological roots. But he was a farmer in Arizona who had a side job collecting gold just for making some extra money on the side. And he started noticing that strange things were happening on his farm. When he was collecting this gold, something was manifesting with the gold, and it was kind of sometimes ruining the gold, and it was acting in ways that he had never heard of any substance acting. So he collected some of it and he took it to some really knowledgeable scientists to run some analysis on it. Mm-hmm. And eventually he was led to a substance that is called white powder gold. Whether in some cases it might not even be gold, although there's definitely clear ties to gold. He was mentioning other elements like iridium and rhodium that have similar characteristics. But I cite his work extensively in Hidden History of Humanity. I didn't want to cite all the stuff that I cited directly in the book, but I ended up doing a lot of that because so many of my internet links get scrubbed. And it's just frustrating. I guess people are going to hit links and they're going to find that they're dead. So that's why I didn't want to include. I mean, it's already a huge book, but I ended up including a lot of material in the book just in case stuff gets deleted. But
you gotta take screen caps and shit these days, man. Like Billy Carson does the same thing where he'll have all these links like to HTTPS / whatever the hell, and then it's like it doesn't go anywhere. And the question is like, it's gonna make you look like an ass,
right? Exactly.
It's gonna make you look like you're lying, and then the truth is that somebody doesn't want you to be able to access and distribute that information. Or that the guy who did it is no longer maintaining that website. One of the two. Yeah.
Right. And then my question, which I know I need to do the research on this and get this question answered to myself, but one of the trends that's developed in relation to this phenomenon is becoming adept at something called the Wayback Machine, which I just have not become adept at that. But supposedly, from what I'm hearing, again, I need to do more digging on it, but they say that if you access this Wayback Machine, you can plug in the links that are dead and they will come back because it somehow captured a record of things when they were on the internet and stored them all just in order to avoid this catastrophe. But like I said, I have to investigate to see how true that is. But in any event, basically, he was saying that in the ancient writings, when people were talking about this substance, this food of the gods that was granting eternal life, that it was a form of white powder gold, it was a drink, and constantly the word that was used to refer to it was manna, 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 which translated into a sentence actually of what is it? Now, as I was trying to figure out, is there a connection between white powder gold and this mushroom? Like, for example, is it possible that a form of this gold is actually present in the mushroom? Because if so, that would explain why we're getting the same phenomenon from the same source. I was just led to a tantalizing clue, and the clue is by no means decisive or concluding the debate in any way, shape, or form. But I just started thinking logically, and I asked myself the question: is there ever an ability to correlate the presence of a mineral to a specific plant? Like, for example, if there's a certain tree, can we think to ourselves, okay, well, if you see that certain tree, then there's a good chance that there's gold in the soil.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
yeah. Okay. So when you grant that that's a possibility, then, how many concepts are we overlapping one on top of the other? Is it possible the tree of life, manna, white powder gold, and mushrooms all have a connection based on that? I don't know, but I think it's possible.
You're listening to KEEP in the Keep. If you love this show and you love supporting indie video games, please take a moment to check out In the Keep's upcoming Stellar Valkyrie. Built in the GZ Doom engine, this retro first-person shooter puts you in the universe of space bird bounty hunter Falco, who is on a mission to save his ex-girlfriend from the evil Black Star cult. Just type birdgame.space, that's BIRD game.space into your browser. Hit enter, smash the wishlist button, and stay tuned. I want to get back to magic. So we went on a little tangent there, which is fun. But so do you reckon that the reptilian leaders of the world and all that stuff, like, do you reckon they have human followers who are doing rituals that are bigger than we can conceive of?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
So
this would make me, ironically, because I was trying to talk all scientifically about it, but like I would be more open-minded to this about the weather control thing. Like, I reckon if you can get a bunch of people together to do ritual magic, perhaps you could influence the weather through that, and it would be untraceable, and you would be able to dupe the military.
So there's again, some of this material is extremely dark. So some of the more sensitive people, by all means, don't follow up on this research. It may give you nightmares. It just depends on your fortitude and your stomach for how much you can handle. But there is a woman whose name is Jessie Zbotar. Jessie, I think is her first name, and then Zbotar is Czebotar. And her story claims to be that she is an escapee from the highest levels of the dark side. And she offers a great deal of evidence, including sworn testimony, where she's like willing to actually give affidavits and testify in court as to exactly what these people do at the highest level. So if you want to explore what she claims as an inside expert as to what people do on the dark side, she will tell you. I mean, she will tell you that she was present as a little kid, and that she would actually be present in structures where, these are her words, a witch's battle would take place. So there would be one witch versus another witch. Some of them would be communed or locked with demonic forces that would grant them abilities for the combat. and whoever was going to be in charge of a given operation depended on who won the witches' battle. And she also has a great many horrifying details that are probably too much for a lot of people to handle. But if you want to explore why I'm answering his question, that I do think that it's possible that there is actual witchcraft involved. It comes directly from her testimony almost more than any others. But of course, Ike does cite a number of people that he met with who claim to have come from similar circles, and their stories do line up.
I would also throw in there for folks who are interested in this stuff, go read Hostage to the Devil by Father Malachi Martin. And one of the subjects in the book definitely falls into a satanic cult and describes it in detail. The sex magic, the rituals that they would do, and the effect that it had on this person who, in the context of this book, was demonically possessed, of course, because it's written by a Catholic priest. But it corroborates with a lot of Ike's stories with your Alex Jones type folks. The idea that there is ritualistic sex magic involving children seems to be kind of undeniable at this point.
It is to me. For people who are not new and they haven't been exposed to a lot of stuff, it just sounds nuts. But it's just a question of where you are in your research and what you're comfortable with trying to grapple with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. At this point, like, if you're listening to this podcast and you're like, that's too much for you, I don't know what to tell you. Like, it's terrible, but it's probably most likely absolutely true, to the point where we just uncovered two gigantic celebrity people who were involved in this, and one of them allegedly committed suicide, and the other one is we're not even going to get the information because it's being suppressed.
I was just actually watching an interview in relation to some of the stuff that's been coming out during a recent trial. And that's one of the things I would mention. There was a woman who was giving her testimony of some of the stuff that she had seen in there. And she was describing, again, all these horrific details in relation to ritual. And the interviewer paused at one point and said, "So what was the turning point for you? I mean, when did you decide exactly to exit from this group?" And then she looked at him directly and said, "When they murdered my son." She had put a satanic symbol on the back of her neck. It was actually that Baphomet that you were referring to earlier.
Yep.
And she was told that was going to be a sign of protection, and that she would be safe, as long as she did what she was told for the dark side. And then they murdered her son, and then she was like, "Okay, well, you guys are liars." And that, again, I can't really express that enough for anyone who's considering going on the dark side for whatever reason. They lie. I mean, you've been told that from the time you were a little kid about the dark side. You can choose to believe it or not, but they'll tell you whatever they need to tell you, and then you'll be murdered. I mean, I'm not saying this is an insider, because I have no desire to ever explore any of this crap, but from what I've seen, you're used, you may have sudden wealth, and then the second you're no longer of value, you're murdered and thrown into the trash.
Yes. And that seems to happen all the time. Even the most depressing parts of it are when you see someone who seems to be genuinely good who gets in too deep, and then they get compromised.
Oh, yes.
I think Crowley had all the right intentions, and then I think he flew too close to the sun. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
He was involved in all sorts of things that people don't even tell. Everybody wants to talk about his magic, and I think his work is incredible. His actual, like, the Book of the Law, his stuff about, like, the rituals of Solomon, all of this stuff is you can corroborate it. And then he's involved in all of these, like, government, sort of like the British version of the CIA operations. And I don't doubt that he was doing stuff for them. I don't doubt that he was using his version of magic to influence people. But then he just seems to drift off into the dark side. And I have questions about, like, what happened to Malcolm X, what happened to Martin Luther King Jr., what happened to, all these people. Kennedy is the big one. Everybody wants to talk about Kennedy. I don't think we're ever really going to know. Even if they release all the files, we still won't know what happened. So, but there seems to be Jesus of Nazareth. The people who, like, are trying to say something good seem to get either murdered or compromised.
Actually, that does bring me to an interesting story, but let me just have one little sip of water.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So one of the things that began to emerge as a strange trend, and I was really only kind of getting to the depths of this at the very end. And so I put it into an appendix to Hidden History of Humanity, is a strange set of stories. And this, again, could possibly offend a lot of people, but I'm just telling you, what my research indicated. So as Atlantis was falling, it appears as if the dark side of Atlantis, parts of it, did escape and fled to the British Isles and became the Druids. So part of the source material for this
Hold
is a
on,
book
let's
called.
back up for just a second. You reckon the Celtic Druids were on the dark side?
Yep.
Okay, keep going.
Okay. So the information source that started me along this path was Lewis Spence, who wrote a book called History of Atlantis. And one of the more significant ideas he offers that is useful in guiding your thoughts is what he calls the Atlantean cultural complex. These are aspects of culture that tend to show up only in areas that were on either side of the Atlantic and closely connected to what appears to be a lost continent in the Atlantic. And when he traced that dark side to the Druids, it was very interesting to me to track the rest of the story, because in Bushby's first book, trying to unravel the mystery of who the real Jesus was, he wrote a book called The Bible Fraud. And in that book, he does a tremendous historical digging and eventually has led to the conclusion that the Essenes had a serious overlap with the Druids, so that a significant part of the Essenes was actually Druidic and was reporting. So I think there's, in my research, very little question that the Druids, even from ancient times, this is even reinforced in the aforementioned Orlinda book, that practitioners of dark magic that were even present in Hyperborea, in that book, it describes those people being banished and sent to the British Isles, right where the Druids were. So we see ties between the Essenes and the Druids. And then when you track the story of Yeshua, the historical figure around which the biblical character of Jesus was created, according to the research that I've done, you find a very interesting story, which seems to relate to, number one, the fact that Yeshua was initiated in the Great Pyramid of Egypt through those very same mystery schools, like all the other people that I mentioned. He was an initiate there, and a large part of his story is connected to the Great Pyramid in Egypt and carrying those secrets to the Druids. So, in broad strokes, I would say it this way. I would say that a dark group fled Atlantis and got situated as a primary base of operations in what we would call Britain today. And they were the Druids. They were fully aware that the Great Pyramid existed. They knew that it had tremendous powers. They knew that there was a group there that had deep esoteric knowledge. But this Sumer group eventually gets started approximately 5000 BC or whatever, when they started their operation. Then it slowly becomes the recorded Sumer of history once they were rolling. And I think the Druids were quite well aware that there was this other group in the world who was now trying to represent the dark side, but it was obviously doing so in a somewhat non-human way. I think the Druids were quite human and didn't have all this dark side stuff as part of their tradition. So I think it is my belief that the Druids sent an emissary group south to find out more about what this new group in Sumer was doing. And I believe the name of this emissary group was the Chaldeans. And I believe that the Chaldeans eventually became the high priests in Egypt that were known by the name Haparu or Habaru, or which eventually becomes Hebrew. Or so that word is actually designating high priest. In my belief, and this is just my belief, I don't think that word Hebrew is referring to the Jewish people. I think it's actually referring to the high priests. And I believe those high priests were Chaldeans, and they were actually Europeans and not Africans or Asians. And I have several reasons to reinforce that are tied to the story of Abraham and getting us to a big thing. I just want to get to the point that
I'm with you on Abraham not being from where they think he's from.
Okay. So
we're on the same page there.
Okay. So I think that these Chaldeans were trying to find out what the Sumer group was doing, and they were initially fighting them, and then it was, if you can't beat them, join them, and then they thought, okay, we're going to form an alliance with these guys, and we'll see where this story takes us. And so when this clash occurs at the time of Yeshua, I think it's his bloodline that helps create this rift. The story that is told by Bushby in Bible Fraud is that Yeshua is of the Herodian line of royalty that is in the area that we would think of as Judea. And as such, he's actually is half Jewish, and his bloodline traces back also to the Edomian line, which is another way of saying the Edomite tribe that goes far back in ancient history. But the other side of the bloodline is the part that's interesting. Now, and this is the part I know that will offend a lot of people. I'm just, like I said, all I'm doing is citing what my research showed. So what Bushby talked about in the Bible Fraud is that the father of Yeshua is actually not God. It was actually the second Roman emperor, whose name was Tiberius. Now, if you trace Tiberius's genealogy, and do keep in mind that Roman emperors were also kind of out of their minds and loved to deify themselves and say that they were God.
That gives a whole different credence to when Jesus tells Pilate, "You have no power over me except that which is given to you by the Father."
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
That's
that
a
was
whole
brilliant.
different way of looking at that phrase, but yes, okay.
Yeah, and actually, and just to clarify this too, because people who know my research might say, well, how come he didn't add in that extra point? So let me add in the extra point. So in Bible Fraud, Bushby tells the story that Yeshua was one of two twins. He had a twin brother named Judas Crestus or Judas Thomas. I had not heard this before, but one of the things that's interesting is when you try to dig into the story of Yeshua through Roman history. Now, you have to think about that a little bit. The Romans were pretty good at keeping records. Do we really think that a son of God was going to manifest among them and be crucified and come back from the dead, and the Roman records would just completely ignore that? So when you dig into the Roman records trying to find out, is there any reference to anybody like this who was crucified? Bushby kept using the term Christians, Khrestians. He didn't use Christians with an I. And I thought, interesting. But then when I did the actual research, actually there is reference to Christians, not to Christians. Christians coming from a root word Christos, anointed in oil. And a lot of those anointings, by the way, were with crocodile oil. So that's something to keep in mind too. But the basic idea here was that the story of the two twins, as Bushby tells the story later in his third book, Crucifixion of Truth, is that Constantine was of the bloodline of Yeshua. And he decides to, at one point during the Council of Nicaea, about 325 AD, to unify the story of the twins into one being. So Judas Crestus and Yeshua get combined into the character that becomes Jesus Christ. And when Judas Crestus is going about his life, he's going about it very differently than Yeshua is. Yeshua studies at the temple. He's studying a lot of spiritual stuff. He's in with the Essenes. He's learning about healing and spirituality and all this other stuff. But Judas Crestus is actually a zealot, which is part of the movement who was sick of Roman occupation. They couldn't stand the oppressive taxes. They wanted to overthrow the government. So eventually, Judas Crestus is of the opinion, let's start an overthrow. Let's take over. I mean, technically, I am of royal blood, so I should have a right to become the Roman emperor if I want to. So he puts together a plot. The story actually differs a little bit from the one in the New Testament in that the story that's centered in Jerusalem in Bushby's historical record is actually centered closer to Rome, where Judas Crestus showed up with a military force and was like, "Hey, I'm staking my claim to the throne," and that's an unpardonable offense, which does need to result in crucifixion. And so there is a crucifixion that is actually scheduled for the twin brother because he is trying to take over the Roman Empire. And there's a rule in ancient Rome that you're allowed to substitute somebody for yourself if you're of royal blood, so that you don't have to be crucified yourself, but someone else can be your substitute. That's actually the story that's in the New Testament, although very few people catch it. The Gospel of Mark is the one that is closest to being historically accurate. And in that gospel, it will tell you the story that, well, it doesn't say Judas Crestus. It says that Jesus was on his way up to be crucified, but some man, Simon of Cyrene, intervenes on his behalf. But, I call this the worst case of an unclear antecedent in all time, because Simon of Cyrene takes the cross, walks up to the place to be crucified, and then it says he was crucified. Never switched the antecedent back to Jesus. So that means that Simon of Cyrene was actually the one who went up. And as later research shows, this Simon of Cyrene, there's a website that people are free to explore the same evidence that I explored. It's at a website that's called Nazareans.com, Nazoreans.com. And it tells the story of another being who was assimilated into the creation of the character of Jesus. And this being is known in ancient times as Apollonius of Tyana. And his life, as shown by Bushby in, I think this is in Bible Fraud, where he's showing the genealogy of Jesus, it appears as if Apollonius of Tyana is none other than the being who would become known as St. Paul. So St. Paul, Apollonius of Tyana, probably the exact same person. Apollonius of Tyana, by the way, was also an initiate into the mystery school in Egypt. And what is also of just tremendous, intriguing interest in all of this is the story that Bushby tells in relation to Yeshua, which is that Yeshua, being initiated in the Great Pyramid of Egypt, knew a great deal about the secrets of the Great Pyramid and possibly had been assigned a task from the Druids to bring as much secret information as possible from Egypt all the way back to the Druids. Now, some people might say, well, how in the world would he possibly have a way to do that? Well, the answer is actually crystal clear. Bushby talks about this extensively in the Bible Fraud. And what he talks about is the tin trade in the ancient world. So the tin trade, tin is a very easy to work metal. It has the lowest melting temperature of any metal to work. And a tin trade was part of the practice of Joseph of Arimathea, who was also of the Herodian line and is none other than the Joseph of the Bible. So this Joseph of Arimathea, indulging in a lucrative tin trade, obtains his tin primarily from Great Britain in Cornwall, where there is a tradition of Jesus existing, especially in the area of Glastonbury. So Yeshua accompanied Joseph of Arimathea on his tin trade route. So once Yeshua had any information that was of great importance taken out of Giza, he could transport it along the tin trade route and carry that directly back to the Druids, who I'm sure were seizing every piece of information they could about what was going on in the world. Now, something else that came up that I find incredibly interesting is that Apollonius of Tyana is supposedly one of the people who had extra information and details regarding the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. And he supposedly was one of the people who was extracting that information and bringing it north to the Druids. Now, some of the people who have stumbled across this, the first time I stumbled across this was from somebody who was saying, I don't believe this is true. I don't think any of this is accurate. I think this is a lie. But as soon as I heard it, I thought to myself, wow, what an extraordinary set of coincidences. If Apollonius of Tyana truly was part of the family line of Yeshua, and as Bushby tells this story, this is a very deep and intense story that is told in secret in the Bible. The Pyramidion that was atop the Great Pyramid is one of the greatest structures that ever existed on the planet because of its energetic properties. So what Bushby tells us about is that in the same way that I was describing Tesla's work that was based on mass resonance of copper spheres, and that was the key to the resonance structure for him was mass resonance, it appears as if the core of technology was actually not so much the mass resonance of the Pyramidion stones, but energetic resonance. And the energetic resonance was of a special waveform that was produced in Pyramidions. This waveform was known as the rainbow snake. So to understand what the rainbow snake is, think of a prism. So if you have a prism and you shine a beam of sunlight in it, it'll split the beam into rainbow colors. And when you do that with a Pyramidion, it apparently generates a rainbow waveform that looks like a snake in 3 dimensions. So imagine that is now being the basis for resonance for carrying signals from point A to point B. So what Bushby shows is that what is most important about the Bible is not so much the literal truth of the tales, which have been warped and twisted in countless ways, but the letters in which the alphabet was written. And what Bushby shows is that this energetic waveform called the rainbow serpent can be viewed from different angles. So Just picture an odd object like a distorted spring or something lying on a table. Now imagine a camera photographing that spring from a multitude of different angles, north, south, east, west, high, low. And then you end up with different shapes when you're viewing this thing from different angles. What Bushby then shows is that the letters of the Hebrew alphabet are actually derived from different camera angles of the rainbow serpent. So the significance of the Bible to him is not so much whatever literal truths may or may not exist in it, but the characters, the actual letters that were hinting of the nature of the rainbow serpent. And what Bushby tells is Yeshua stole a copy of the Torah from Giza and from some of the Jewish authorities who had aspects of it, almost as if he too, like Apollonius of Tyana, was trying to extract the secrets of Giza, bring them north to the Druids, so that the Druids could instead be the group that was in charge of this bloodline trying to take over the world. Now, for some people, they may say, okay, well, that's crazy. What other historical elements are there to this? How about there are tons of them? How about the split in religion between the Protestants and the Catholics? When you trace the origins of Protestantism, I was led to an incredibly interesting place, and I might not have caught this if it weren't for me reading so much science fiction. So when I read a lot of science fiction growing up, one of my favorite authors was Piers Anthony. And he wrote a book that was supposed to be one book called The Tarot, but it was split into a trilogy, the Tarot trilogy, by the publishing houses.
Tarot,
and
like Tarot.
Correct. So that was my introduction to tarot cards, which Bushby shows are tied to the Great Pyramid. They had their origin in the Great Pyramid with four ancient objects of power.
Yeah, so they all, for people who aren't familiar, if you open up a deck of tarot cards and lay them out, I would recommend the Thoth deck, but whatever ones you want. The reason why I say Thoth is because they were rearranged to actually be in order of the Hebrew alphabet, but they are all directly coordinated with the hieroglyphs.
He is exactly right. And what Tyler just said is dead on. And what Bushby showed in Secret in the Bible, he can actually show you the pictures. So now, see, this is part of the problem. Yeah. You know, we have translations of languages from one to the other. So by the time the Bible gets to English, I mean, what the heck are you going to do with the English characters? They have no correspondence to what the original imagery or letters were. So in relation to that, what Bushby shows you is some of the original imagery. You can see how the 22 major trumps in the Tarot deck correspond to letters of the alphabet. So yes, all of these secrets were apparently being taken out. And one of the things that was really interesting, I just was triggered when I was reading through this history about the Protestants, because what Piers Anthony cited, because he likes citing actual history when he's putting together science fiction too, to write more meaningful type fiction. And the Tarot trilogy, or Tarot, which is now one book, he went back and had it published as one book. He tells the story of the Waldensians. And I was thinking, that was the first time I heard about the Waldensians, was when Piers Anthony was writing about the Tarot deck of cards. And so it's like, this is weird. So then what you end up with is something along these lines. If Bushby's theory is correct, then it was Judas Crestus who was assigned to be crucified. Apollonius of Tyana goes up. Joseph of Arimathea bribes a Roman official. Apollonius of Tyana comes down before actually dying, and he suffered the penalty. He used mystery school techniques to survive the crucifixion, which is talked about at that Nazarene's website that I mentioned. The secrets from Egypt are carried north to the Druids. The bloodline of Yeshua continues because he ends up living in England and becoming part of the bloodline of the Druids, and actually becomes part of the Druidic bloodline, which then eventually goes through time, reaches Constantine. So that Constantine is actually of the same bloodline as Yeshua and Judas Crestus. He deifies his ancestors in order to build up his own political power. This is one of the main reasons why religions are formed, is to create human authority figures that are like gods, so that everyone will obey them and submit to them. So the line of Constantine then goes forward to King Arthur, and from King Arthur, I would argue it goes through what I call a Charlemagne scramble, where the Merovingians are supposedly of the bloodline of Yeshua, that after the Charlemagne scramble, which I don't think that Charlemagne was part of the bloodline, although he's considered to be part of the bloodline. I think the reptiles started corrupting the bloodline at that point. Charlemagne has a gazillion different ancestors, but these lead to the Waldensians that lead to the Protestants who were fighting against the Catholics, who are controlled by the Pope, who is part of the reptile group. So now we're looking at the Druidic Protestant group in a rivalry with the Sumerian reptilian group. And then we get to the founding of the United States. And look at this. We have most of our presidents are Protestants, and apparently they seem to have ties to a lot of the dark forces in England. So for me, when you mention Yeshua, I can't help but think part of the story of Yeshua is not what it seems to be. And it seems to be the story of a rivalry that goes all the way back to the times of Atlantis between a group that eventually became the Druids in a rivalry with the forces of Sumer, and that possibly to this day, these two groups are still in a rivalry.
It's very interesting. While you were talking, it came to me, like I was thinking about the switcheroo with Simon that you brought up, right?
Yep.
This is obviously not Peter Simon. And I'm gonna assume it's not Simon the Zealot either, because both of them go on and continue to have a story. There's a third Simon in the New Testament that comes to mind, Simon the Sorcerer, or Simon Magus, who is like known for he's kind of the Christian archetype for someone who tries to buy their way into salvation, right?
Exactly. And you just nailed the whole circuit there. So
yeah.
Since we're not going to have time to get into this, I know that we're stretching the patience of our listeners here, but if you go to that Nazareans website that we mentioned before, you will see a breakdown of exactly what all the names that Tyler just mentioned. You will see them present at that website, where a bunch of scholars are trying to sort through all the names he just mentioned and show you how they break it down. And you can sort through that and see it.
Yeah. Yeah. The word magus is a beautiful word. It's most tarot decks, it's the first card.
Yep.
It's properly the second card. But yeah, so the word magus, our modern word magic, comes from magi, which is an ancient Persian word, right? So the three magi, the three wise men who visit Jesus on his birth, right?
Yeah, and that actually goes back to mystery school traditions that are traced at another website called mythicism.com, and it'll show you the precedents for the three wise men.
Yeah, they're Zoroastrian priests from the East. It's pretty clear, but people don't put that two and two together. It's only mentioned in Matthew, the 2nd chapter, too. They never get brought up otherwise. But following the star, right? The Star of Bethlehem. We've seen the star in the East. We come to worship him, all that stuff. They bring him specifically gifts of frankincense, myrrh, and gold because they are doing a ritual.
Exactly. And one of the things that Bushby points out for people who might be resistant to his work is that so far as he can tell, the Gospel of Mark comes from a being who is also known as Marcellus, who himself was a druid of the bloodline of Yeshua. So
interesting.
More food for thought.
Oh, man. You want to go ahead and call it a day, and we'll do this again later, maybe like in a few months, or when you have something new to talk about? Anytime, literally anytime, just like, hey, I got some new research I want to talk about. You can come back on the show. This has been great. Really fun. And
absolutely. I feel the same way. You've been a joy to talk to. I love the fact that you're so well researched. It just makes the whole conversation easier, like I sort of anticipated from the way that you were conducting yourself before we even got in the air. So yeah, I mean, I'd be delighted to talk to you anytime. And just let me know. And I will definitely let you know, but we should maybe give things at least a month, and I'll need at least a day to heal my voice.
Of course. Thank you so much to Tim for coming on the show and sharing all of his research with us. It's very, very intriguing, to say the least. You can go to his website, which I will leave in the show notes, and you can actually grab his books. He's actually working on a print to order, I think, as we speak, but you can just email him and request PDF format of whatever you want. Maybe he has a few copies and some of them left. And let me know what you guys think of some of this stuff in the comments, or even in the Discord channel, discord.inthekeep.com. I'm very, very curious to see how people react to some of this information. that he, shared with us. Thank you to all of you for listening. Remember, the best way that you can support the show is to tell someone else how much you love the show and that they should listen to it as well. Just one other person would be great. You can also support through inthekeep.com/support. There's Patreon, there's coffee, there's the book list, there's all kinds of stuff. So whatever makes the most sense for you. I love you. God love you. Stay in the keep. Stay in the keep. Come back now, y'all. Mwah. Let's take a moment to talk about Appalachia TCG. Whether you're searching for sports cards, Magic the Gathering, Flesh and Blood, Pokemon, or Yu-Gi-Oh!, they can offer you an extensive selection to suit every collector and competitor. As an official reseller, they are committed to providing authentic booster packs, singles, accessories, and rare finds that set them apart from competitors. They buy and sell lots of trading cards and toys, but their special is the Flesh and Blood trading card game, and they run official events, pre-releases, and more. Along with their ever-growing community, Appalachia TCG is the premium spot for trading, buying, and selling cards. I know what you're thinking, but I don't live in Eastern Kentucky. Well, that's the best part. You can shop online and in person. There is the official TCG player shop, eBay store, and online shop. Head on over to AppalachiaTCG.com. That's AppalachiaTCG.com. Tell them In the Keep sent you.
Hi, I'm Ben, host of the Field and Foley podcast. Every episode I sit down with incredible guests, not just sound designers, field recorders, or musicians, but experts in everything about audio. We explore the creative process behind the sounds that shape our favorite games, films, and experiences. Whether you're an audio professional or just someone who loves great sound, Field and Foley offers deep dives, behind-the-scenes stories, and insights you won't hear anywhere else.